The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Chairman Nadler is running a little bit late, so in order to get to our witnesses, the staff has asked that I begin, and he will give his opening statement upon his arrival. I want to welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on oversight of family separation and CBP short-term custody under the Trump administration, and I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. We're here today to hold the administration accountable for its failure to effectively manage the humanitarian crisis at the border and for continuing to mistreat children and families. Nearly 6 months have passed since our first hearing on the Trump administration's family separation policy, and yet parents and children are still being separated and detained in deplorable conditions every day. Less than 2 weeks ago, Vice President Pence stated that U.S. Custom and Border Protection is providing compassionate care to immigrants in a way that, quote, every American would be proud of. But just 2 weeks earlier, DHS's own Inspector General released the second of 2 management alerts detailing the overcrowded and dangerous conditions at CBP facilities in Texas. Unlike the Vice President, I do not believe that Americans are proud of how we're treating these children, and I know of no parent who would want their child housed in conditions that deprive them of nutritious food, safe water, clean clothing, and a place to sleep, not to mention the soap, toothpaste, and toothbrushes that this administration in open court argued were not necessary for the health and sanitation of detainees. Acting Secretary McAleenan has stated that families are only separated when CBP is unable to confirm the relationship between the child and the person claiming to be the parent or legal guardian, or when the child's safety is at risk. But the government's own data disproves this. Out of 400 children separated from their parents between June 2018 and March 2019, only 3% were separated for these reasons. And of those cases, it is now clear that CBP made egregious errors in some of those separations. Take, for example, Maria, a pseudonym, a client of the National Immigration Justice Center who was separated from her child upon arrival. 1 month later, Maria learned that her child had been taken from her because she had been identified as having a criminal history in her home country. Maria denied this, but it was not until lawyers obtained official documents from El Salvador proving that she had no criminal background that she was allowed to reunite with her son. A full 3 months later, when they finally got together, Maria's son was withdrawn and disconnected from his mother. While the Trump administration claims that its policies are the only way to manage the current influx of immigrants at the border, that's not true. Every administration has grappled with migration challenges, but none have exposed children and families to such appalling conditions. No administration has resorted to the cruelty of systematically separating kids from their parents as a method of deterrence. We're dealing with an administration that has dehumanized immigrant children and families and refuses to implement smart immigration policies. As a result, Border Patrol agents report low morale, high stress, and an inability to focus on their primary responsibility of protecting our borders. Asylum officers report that the migrant protection protocols, otherwise known as the Remain in Mexico policy, had made problems at the border even worse. A competent and capable administration would have planned for the expected arrival of families and children seeking protection and developed the necessary infrastructure to ensure that those who must be detained are held in humane conditions. A capable administration would identify and detain those individuals who may pose a risk to our country and release under supervision until an immigration hearing those who pose no risk so that overcrowding is not an issue. But we're not dealing with a competent and capable administration. The administration's family separation policy has stained our nation and will have lasting effects on those who are subjected to it. As a mother and a grandmother, my heart aches for all of them. But as a member of this committee, I know that real solutions are required, and we will keep bringing the administration before us until we find them. I would now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And here we are again. We've had this same hearing in February. We noted the crisis on the southern border being fueled by loopholes in our immigration laws. Border Patrol Chief Provost testified legislative changes were needed to get the situation under control. In fact, we've heard that over and over and over and over again. But the crisis has gotten worse. In February, the Border Patrol apprehended 66,000 individuals. That number has been above 92,000 every month since, peaking at over 132 apprehensions in May alone. You know, just last week I was horrified and deeply affected when Secretary McClellan told me that there are 3 ongoing cases where a small group of children, 5 to 8, in each case have been used by dozens of different adults to cross our border seeking release in the U.S. And my colleague's claim is we care. Look, I'm gonna stop. I'm not gonna read this. You know what is dehumanizing? Is continuing to bring the same witnesses or the same people from the same agencies to talk about this over and over and over again. What's dehumanizing is doing that and not doing anything about it. That's what's dehumanizing. It's talking about a problem, talking about a problem, talking about a problem, and never putting a solution up. I've talked about this almost at every one of these so far, especially in the last few weeks. And look, my Democratic colleagues have ideas. I may disagree with those ideas, but put a bill up. I have a bill, put mine up. Make amendments to it. Do whatever you want to do. That's what Congress is supposed to do. Dehumanizing is this. This is dehumanizing. And also, what a competent and capable majority would do is actually put a bill forward. Instead, we're not a competent and capable majority, undoubtedly using the words of the ranking member of the subcommittee. We're not capable and competent because we're not putting bills forward. We're having bash the president time, bash the administration time. This is all it was, is all this is. I appreciate you being here to testify. Some of you have been here before, some of you are replacing the ones who had already testified before. Mr. White, you're back again. Good to see you. This is what bothers me. I can read another opening statement, we can ask questions, and we'll all go through this, and we can talk about how the Trump administration is not competent, not capable. I think that just falls back on us. It falls back on this committee. Why has the majority not put a bill forward? We've heard that it doesn't work. We've heard from both administrations, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, that laws need to be fixed and worked on, but we don't do it. We put together this week, we passed on the floor, we passed out of this committee, a bill that was a Band-Aid to fix a little bit of problem, which everybody ought to be treated humanely and as best they can at the border, and we need to have that. That needs to happen. But we just did it in such a way yesterday that it just applied to everybody and again applied to nobody in a sense. So as we look at this, as we go forward, you know, Madam Chair, I agree with you. You and I have worked on big things before. But what is dehumanizing is this hearing. What is dehumanizing is this hearing where we're going to talk about it again, and people come, and the folks in this audience, I'm glad you're here. We're trying to work on a problem, but don't accept another hearing. Accept some answers. Accept some bills being put forward. Don't be fooled again. If you want to take part in a political positioning paper, then that's what we're doing today. Because we've already heard, no offense to our witnesses, we've heard your statements already before. So I don't know what's going to move us this time that didn't move us last time. This is becoming, unfortunately, a committee of press releases. That's it. Dehumanizing is taking people you say you care about but doing nothing for them. That's dehumanizing. Competent and capable, the last time I understood, Congress should pass legislation. I'll be very slow. Pass bills that matter. Don't have hearings that are simply stunts. I think about these kids being used. I think about the issue with the Flores agreement, with the trafficking victims issue, with the asylum issue. Things that have been talked about by multiple administrations. And even under us, even under the previous Congress, I'll go ahead and say it before anybody else does. Republicans didn't do anything. You know what was really funny? When they had a chance this year to work on the Dreamer bill, the majority leader went to the floor and said, we could have worked on this. Last year we were one signature away from passing a Dreamer bill, getting it off the table and passing it. Then why didn't you bring that bill back to the floor? It was one vote. You had one signature away. Now you're in the majority. You should have been able to pass it and probably would have passed it with 40 or 50 votes. No, but I'll tell everybody watching, you know the reason you didn't? Because we didn't have it political enough. The Dreamer bill, we had to add in everything else. Not that it could get passed, not that we could help the Dreamers, not that we could help the DACA recipients. We wanted a political stunt, and if it wasn't, then I challenge you. Go ask the majority leader why he didn't bring back the bill from last year. I'll tell you why. It's because it was something that would pass, but didn't have everything else political on there. So, Madam Chair, I appreciate it. I couldn't read the rest of this. I mean, this is dehumanizing. This is showing a non-competent, non-capable majority. It's showing a Congress that is willing to listen to problems and not act on problems. So here we go. Popcorn machine's ready. If anybody wants some, send the office over here. The show begins. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I would note that the chairman of the committee will be recognized for his opening statement when he arrives. So at this point, I will recognize the ranking member for the Immigration Subcommittee, Mr. Buck, for his opening statement.
Thank you. As I've been saying for months now, there is a crisis on the southern border. What has the Democrat response been to the crisis? The majority spent the first 6 months of this year denying there was a problem. Some Democrats claim the crisis was manufactured. The House Democratic whip even laughed at the crisis. What else have Democrats done? In February, Democrats cut funding for ICE detention beds in the omnibus spending bill. One article suggested the Democrats' bill would encourage ICE to detain fewer immigrants and asked, will it work? We now know the answer. No. The committee heard testimony from Carla Provost, Chief of Customs and Border Protection, that her agents were facing a, quote, border security and humanitarian crisis, end quote. On the very same day, the Democrat majority passed a resolution rejecting the president's emergency declaration targeted at addressing the crisis. House progressives objected to passing a supplemental funding bill a few weeks ago to provide needed resources to address the crisis. This crisis is not only being felt at the border, it is being felt in many small towns across the country. Recently, several mayors went to the border and saw the crisis firsthand. They commented on how it impacts their community. Quote, cities were among the first to feel the impact of this crisis, and local communities have made extraordinary efforts to alleviate the human suffering, Rochester Hills, Michigan Mayor Brian Bennett has said. We're pleased that Congress recently provided some emergency funding, but it's clear that more must be done to meet the needs at the border. Mesa, Arizona Mayor John Giles said, we had a frank and candid discussion with Acting Secretary McAleenan about the realities that border cities face each day and the need for the federal government to find solutions that prioritize the health and well-being of asylum seekers without draining community resources. We've had in the previous 3 months 5,000 people come through our shelter in Yuma, Mayor Douglas Nichols said. The city of Yuma is 100,000 people, so it's a big impact on our community. In the past 4 months, Yuma has spent $1.5 million for migrant care. Perhaps nowhere is the impact of Washington's failures and the Democrats' negligence more acutely felt by America's mayors than in the area of education. According to one estimate, educating the children of illegal immigrants poses a cost to America's public schools of $59.8 billion per year, with 98.9% borne by state and local taxpayers. As illegal immigration increases, costs have skyrocketed, including for limited English proficiency programs that are a major drain on school budgets. Commenting on the impact of local government, Randy Capps of the Migration Policy Institute has said, public education is where the real big cost comes in. The amount of taxes that the parents pay, it's not going to be as much as is spent on public education for their kids and food stamps for their kids. Last week, the Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee heard testimony that policies passed by Congress contribute greatly to USCIS processing backlogs. We've also heard congressional policy can have a devastating impact, encouraging and incentivizing illegal immigration. For example, the situation involving unaccompanied minors was made worse, much worse, by legislation pushed by Senator Feinstein and passed by Congress in 2008. The number of unaccompanied children grew from 8,041 in 2008 to 50,036 last year, a 622% increase. The federal agencies have sounded the alarm, local governments have sounded the alarm, think tanks have sounded the alarm, Republicans have sounded the alarm, the president has sounded the alarm. Despite this, Democrats refuse to address the root causes of the problem and in turn refuse to solve the crisis. They would rather ignore the problem or even make it worse than acknowledge the president is right. What do we need to do? First, we need a stronger commitment from Congress to secure the border, and this includes building the wall. Second, we need to pass H.R. 586. This bill will help keep families together while fixing some of the rules that currently tie the hands of DHS. It will close loopholes related to human trafficking. And finally, it will prevent frivolous asylum claims, allowing the agencies to focus on and prioritize genuine claims. I hear repeatedly from those on the other side of the dais that someone is not an illegal alien if they file an asylum claim. That is not true if the applicant has filed a fraudulent claim. In that case, the applicant is not in the country legally because they have committed immigration fraud. We need to enact reforms overriding the judicial settlement that ties the hands of the agencies responsible for securing our border. America will always be a place that welcomes legal immigrants. This great nation will always have a generous immigration policy, but we need an immigration system that works for America, and we cannot continue to ignore or, given Democrat policy priorities, make worse the crisis at the border. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and hope they will share with us what Congress can do to address the crisis, and even more, hope Democrats in Congress will not only listen, but take the right action. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This is the Judiciary Committee's hearing on oversight of family separation and CBP short-term custody. We have two functions in Congress. One is passing bills, and second is oversight, to see that the laws are being faithfully executed. Today, we have a number of witnesses who will help us understand whether the administration is falling short in its obligation to see that the laws are being faithfully executed. I will introduce them now. Brian Hastings is the chief of the Law Enforcement Operations Directorate at the Border Patrol headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he's responsible for oversight of the day-to-day law enforcement operations at Border Patrol sectors. Chief Hastings has served with the U.S. Border Patrol since 1995, and over the course of his tenure there, he's worked in various sectors and Border Patrol divisions in a variety of leadership positions. Prior to his current position, he served as Chief Patrol Agent of the Buffalo sector from 2012 until November of 2017. Jonathan Hayes serves as the Director of Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to being named Acting Director in November and being formally installed as Director in February of this year, Mr. Hayes was Chief of Staff for the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Office of Director. Mr. Hayes has also served as Chief of Staff to two members of Congress and has experience in the private sector, specializing in broadcast sales and marketing, international trade and customs, and commercial airline operations. Jonathan White is Commander of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps at the Department of Health and Human Services. He is currently a Senior Advisor in the Office of Emergency Management and Medical Operations, and he was the Federal Health Coordinating Official for the Unaccompanied Alien Child Reunification Mission from June to December of 2018. Commander White is a career public health officer who has worked with HHS for nearly a decade. He is a licensed clinical social worker, emergency manager, and certified public health professional. Joseph Edlow currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General with the Office of Legal Policy at the Department of Justice, where he focuses on immigration policy. Before joining the department in 2018, Mr. Edlow worked in Congress for one of our own former members, Mr. Raul Labrador of Idaho, and also served as his counsel for the Immigration Subcommittee. Prior to that, he worked at the Baltimore, Maryland Immigration and Custom Enforcement Field Office, where as Assistant Chief Counsel, he represented DHS in removal proceedings and specialized in worksite enforcement, national security, and gang members. And finally, Diana Shaw was appointed the Assistant Inspector General for Special Reviews and Evaluations for the Department of Homeland Security of Inspector General in March of this year. Ms. Shaw has also served in several other leadership positions with the Inspector General's Office, including Assistant Inspector General for Legal Affairs, Acting Counsel to the Inspector General, Director of the Special Review Groups, and Acting Assistant Inspector General for External Affairs. Prior to joining the Office of the Inspector General, Ms. Shaw practiced law with a firm's white-collar crime group, specializing in internal investigations and compliance counseling. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. And now, if you will please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. If you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? And the record will note that each of the witnesses replied in the affirmative, and we will now receive your testimony. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety, and accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in about 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, we have a lighting system. When the light switches from green to yellow, it means you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony, and when the light turns red, it means your 5 minutes is up. So we'd ask you to try and finish up when that occurs. Chief, let's begin with you.
Good morning, Chairman Adler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee. You've asked me here today to testify regarding the allegations that CBP has begun the widespread separation of children. Let me be clear, this is not occurring. Border Patrol has separated less than 1,000 children of the approximately 413,000 family members apprehended, or 0.45 of all families we've apprehended this fiscal year. Separation is an incredibly rare occurrence and only takes place in compliance with the President's June 20, 2018 executive order and preliminary injunction in the Miss L v. ICE case. The vast majority of separation involve adults who, due to their criminal or gang history, would not be eligible for release had they been apprehended alone. Bringing a child illegally into the U.S. should not entitle anyone to be released into U.S. communities. Many of the cases discussed recently involve family members other than parents or legal guardians. The laws passed by Congress define an unaccompanied alien child, or a UAC, as a child without a parent or legal guardian. By law, Border Patrol is required to turn over all UACs to HHS. Since late June, members of Congress have been vocal about the condition of Border Patrol facilities. Frankly, this attention came far too late to address the overwhelming situation that we've raised concerns about for the past 8 months. You've heard the DHS Acting Secretary state that 4,000 aliens in custody across the entire southwest border is an acceptable level. We first surpassed 10,000 people in custody in April 13th of 2019. By May, apprehensions had spiked to more than 132,000, with as many as 19,500 people in Border Patrol custody. ICE and HHS were unable to keep pace with these record apprehensions. By June 6th, the number of UACs in our custody peaked at 2,700. After Congress passed a supplemental 3 weeks later, providing HHS funding for additional bed space, the number of UACs in Border Patrol custody quickly dropped to 300. By contrast, ICE was denied supplemental funding for single adult bed space, and single adults continue to remain in Border Patrol custody much longer than they should. I'm very concerned that if ICE is unable to take custody of these adults, that we will have to start direct releases at the border. I can tell you that this will create a draw that we've never experienced and result in a complete loss of border security. As Chief Provost testified yesterday, the crisis is not over and supplemental funding is only a Band-Aid. Apprehension numbers have decreased from May to June, but 94,000 aliens that we apprehended in the month of June was higher to any June dating back to 2000. The $1.1 billion provided to CBP in the supplemental will help us continue surging agents and officers to assist with the crisis, as well as continuing investing in the soft-sided facilities, air and ground transportation, medical support, and consumables. We did not wait for additional funding to start making those investments. We had already contracted for 6 soft-sided facilities to provide additional capacity before the supplemental was passed. Additionally, we've purchased or leased 515 showers, 240 portable toilets, 24 washers and dryers for the areas that we have the highest apprehensions. To be clear, there has never been a shortage of personal care items for detainees, such as food, snacks, diapers, formula, and hygiene products. We've purchased those items out of operational fundings for months and will continue to do so with the additional supplemental funding. While the men and women of Border Patrol have been doing their best in an overwhelming situation for months, so much energy has been forced on vilifying them. In the same way inappropriate conduct by an agent is unacceptable, it's also unacceptable to broadly paint all agents as heartless and inhumane. On a daily basis, agents are feeding and caring for migrants, consoling children, and rescuing over 4,000 aliens that smugglers have placed into peril. They continue to perform their humanitarian mission, knowing that they're sacrificing the border security mission they were hired to do, day after day with no end in sight. The funding that was provided to CBP and HHS will only last a few months and will do nothing to address the unsustainably high flow of illegal immigration. Without changes to our immigration system, we'll be back here in a few months. The money will run out, the summer heat will subside, and smugglers will adapt, as they always do, to Mexico's efforts. Each of these endeavors are short-term fixes to a long-term problem. We need a functioning system that can quickly adjudicate immigration cases and asylum claims and quickly return those who are unsuccessful back to their home country. We need legal changes to allow the system to detain families together, quickly repatriate UACs, and set a higher bar for credible fear. Border Patrol has apprehended more than 740,000 individuals so far this year, and without holistic changes to the immigration system, loopholes will continue to be exploited, smugglers will continue to profit, and border security will continue to be sacrificed. Thank you.
Thank you. Be pleased to hear from you, Director Hayes.
Thank you, ma'am. Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee, it is my honor to appear today on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Jonathan Hayes. As the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I manage the Unaccompanied Alien, or UAC, program. I became the permanent director earlier this year, and it is a privilege to serve in this role. I am continually impressed with the level of commitment and professionalism that I see in the ORR career staff and our grantees, who carry out round-the-clock operations in service of some of the world's most vulnerable children. I have visited nearly 50 UAC care provider shelters across the United States over the last year so that I could see firsthand the quality of care provided to these children. Prior to my time at ORR, I worked for 2 congressional members for approximately 8 years. That experience provided me with firsthand knowledge of the important oversight role that you and your staff have to ensure that federal programs operate successfully. I would like to first express the Department's appreciation and gratitude to Congress for passing the Emergency Humanitarian Aid Package. Immediately upon enactment of the supplemental appropriation, we restored the full range of services for UAC that we were unable to provide during the anticipated deficiency. The number of UAC entering the United States during this fiscal year has risen to levels we have never before seen. As of July 15th, DHS has referred more than 61,000 UAC to us, the highest number in the program's history. By comparison, HHS received 59,170 referrals in fiscal year 2016, the previous highest number of annual referrals on record. HHS currently has about 10,000 children in our care, though this number fluctuates on a daily basis. As of June, the average length of time that a child stays in HHS's custody is approximately 42 days. which is a dramatic decrease of 53% from late November 2018, when the average length of care was about 90 days. During my tenure at ORR, we have issued 4 operational directives and revised our policies and procedures with the specific aim of a more efficient and safe release of UAC from our care and custody. HHS does not enforce immigration laws. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice perform those functions. In general, DHS separates parents from their children for reasons recognized by the Missel Court and agreed upon between DHS, HHS, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Those reasons include unverified familial relationship or fraud, criminal history, communicable diseases, danger to the child, or lack of parental fitness. DHS has also separated adults from children based on lack of parentage. Once HHS receives information from DHS that a child has been separated from a potential parent, we first try to establish communication with the separated adult, whether they are in the custody of DHS's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, DOJ's Federal Bureau of Prison, or DOJ's U.S. Marshal Service. HHS works to confirm parentage and to confirm the separation. As of July 8, 2019, HHS has discharged 562 of these minors through removal with their parents through ORR sponsorship process or through voluntary departure. When a child enters ORR care, care provider staff assess each child's needs, including special concerns such as family separation, known medical or mental health issues, and other risk factors. HHS is deeply committed to the physical and emotional well-being of all children in its temporary care. Staff at our care provider facilities are trained in techniques for child-friendly and trauma-informed interviewing, ongoing assessment, observation, and treatment of the medical and behavioral health needs of these children, including those who have been separated from their parents. Care providers must deliver services that are sensitive to the age, culture, and native language of each child. All children participate in weekly individual counseling sessions with trained social work staff, where the provider reviews the child's psychosocial well-being progress, establishes short-term objectives for addressing trauma and other health needs, and addresses developmental and crisis-related needs, including those that may be related to family separation. If children have acute or chronic mental health illnesses, ORR refers them for mental health services within the community. It is the expressed desire and goal of both the political and senior career leadership of ORR to expand our capacity in such a manner as possible so that as many children as possible are placed into permanent state-licensed facilities or transitional foster care while their sponsorship suitability determinations are made or their immigration cases are adjudicated in the event there is no sponsor available. HHS operates nearly 170 licensed care provider facilities and programs across the United States. These care providers include group homes, long-term, therapeutic, or transitional foster care, residential treatment centers, staff-secure and secure facilities, and shelters. Our facilities provide housing, nutrition, routine medical care, mental health services, educational services, and recreational services such as arts and sports, services that are similar to the domestic child welfare system. In closing, please know that my top priority and that of my team is to ensure the safety and well-being of the children who are placed temporarily in HHS care and custody as we work to quickly and safely release them to suitable sponsors. Thank you for the support of the UAC program and the opportunity to discuss our important work. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Director Hayes. Let me apologize for being late. I had an unavoidable commitment, which I won't go into. But with the indulgence of the committee, I'll give my opening statement now, and then we'll resume the testimony. In February, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing to examine the Trump administration's indefensible and repugnant family separation policy. Since then, we have seen how this policy, along with many others, have collectively led to a humanitarian crisis at the border, evidenced by devastating image of children and families squeezed into overcrowded and unsanitary facilities. Instead of addressing the root causes of migration and competently managing the challenges at our border, the Trump administration has chosen to dehumanize immigrants and exploit this crisis for political gain. In doing so, it has violated American laws and values and caused permanent damage to children and families. The inhumanity of family separation can be illustrated by a story that surfaced last week. According to National Public Radio, a Customs and Border Patrol CPB agent forced a 3-year-old child with a serious heart condition to make a serious choice, an impossible choice, to decide which one of her parents she would stay with. Her mother, who was allowed into the United States, or her father, who was forced to remain in Mexico. And she had to choose which one to go to in the presence of the BPP agent. But family separation is just one component of this crisis, as it is clear that conditions at border facilities have deteriorated to an unconscionable level. Twice in the last few months, the DHS Office of Inspector General released reports detailing the severe overcrowding and lack of sanitation at border facilities in Texas. These reports and others are appalling. Facilities lacking safe drinking water and age-appropriate food, a lack of showers and essential personal hygiene products like soap and toothpaste, with some detainees going days or weeks without a shower or the ability to brush their teeth. Children required to share combs during a lice outbreak. Allegations of sexual assault and retaliation against children at the Yuma Processing Center in Arizona. And tragically, the death of 10 people, including 3 children, in CPB custody over the last 10 months. Administration officials would have you believe that these incidents are the exception, not the rule. Yet we have also learned about racist and misogynist posts in a closed Facebook group of nearly 10,000 current and former CBP officers, almost half the force. Posts that joke about migrant deaths and disparage female members of Congress. The sheer size of this Facebook group and the fact that the chief of the Border Patrol, Carla Provost, was allegedly a member at one time is deeply concerning. To be clear, this hearing is not an attack on individual Border Patrol agents, but is an examination of the Trump administration's policies and the culture of disdain and cruelty toward immigrants that stems from the White House and apparently has deeply affected the agency. The inhumane treatment of children and families at the border must be examined in the context of these incidents. There must be accountability for the policy choices that got us here. The Trump administration has repeatedly claimed that border conditions are a result of increased numbers of asylum seekers. But let's be clear, we have the capability to safely process the influx of migrants and deal with the situation with compassion rather than cruelty. And indeed, if the problem were simply an increase in the number of asylum seekers, the solution would be an increase in bed capacity, an increase in the number of asylum judges, and a policy of letting of quick trials and quick adjudications so that we don't face the question of long-term detention or long-term release of asylum claimants without adjudication into the country. Instead, the administration has opted for policy choices that compromise safety and exacerbate the crisis, such as locking up all asylum seekers, which is unprecedented in American history, regardless of whether they pose any danger. Although I hope that one day, hearings like this will no longer be necessary, today we must continue our efforts to bring these issues to light and to hold the Trump administration accountable for its shameful partisan policies. And before I finish my statement, I must take note of the statement to the ranking member. It is not true that we have had sufficient hearings on this. We will not have sufficient hearings on this till the problem is eliminated. Nor is it true that we have done nothing about this but hold hearings. Just last week, or earlier this week, time flies, we passed the Ruiz bill dealing with proper medical conditions at detention facilities. We passed the Dreamers Act. We have taken legislative action, and we will take more. The fact that the administration is hostile to all legislative action which doesn't evince a terrible hostility to immigrants and to people, to refugees who need asylum status is our problem, but it is not our fault. Before I call on the next witness, I want to thank Ms. Lofgren, the distinguished chair of our Immigration Subcommittee, for beginning the hearing in my absence. Commander White, you may proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, members of this committee. It's my honor to appear before you today on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm Jonathan White. I'm a career officer in the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, a clinical social worker and emergency manager. I did serve as the HHS operational lead for the interagency mission to reunify children in ORR care as of June 26, 2018, who had been separated from their parents at the border by DHS. And currently, I'm the HHS's operational lead for the effort to identify children who had been separated from their parents at the border, referred to ORR, and discharged from ORR care prior to June 26, 2018. After Secretary Azar directed ASPR to help ORR comply with the executive order, we formed an incident management team. And our incident management team was tasked by the Secretary to take all reasonable actions to comply with the Ms. L court orders. We worked closely with DHS, including CBP and ICE, to identify all the parents of children in ORR care who met the court's criteria. And as a result, the current reporting of possible children of potential Ms. L class members is 2,814 children. And I want to be very clear, that count of 2,814 children does not include children who were discharged by ORR before June 26, 2018, and it does not include separated children who were referred to ORR care after the 26th. Working in close partnership with colleagues in ICE, DOJ, and Department of State, we first worked to reunify children who had parents in ICE custody. This was an unprecedented effort, requiring a novel process which we developed and the court approved. Under the compressed schedule required by court order of 15 days for children under the age of 5 and 30 days for children between the ages of 5 and 17, we reunified 1,441 children with parents in ICE custody. Those were all the children of eligible and available Ms. L class members in ICE custody. For children whose parents had been in ICE custody but had been released to the interior, we implemented an expedited reunification process. For parents who had left the United States, the ACLU, who serve as plaintiff's counsel for the Ms. L class, obtained from the parents their desire either for reunification in the home country or waiving reunification for children to go through standard OR sponsorship process. And once we received the parents' desire, HHS, DHS, and DOJ coordinated with the ACLU, with the government of the home country, and with the child's family to ensure safe reunification into the care of the parents. So of the 2,814 children, as of the 9th of July, we have reunified 2,167 with the parent from whom they were separated. Another 611 children have left OR care through other appropriate discharges, and in most cases, that means release to a family sponsor, such as the other parent, an adult sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, a more distant relative, or family friend. There are 13 children still in OR care who were separated but can't be reunified with their parent because the parent has a criminal history that poses a specific threat to child safety, or the child has made credible allegations of abuse by the parent. There are 14 children still in OR care whose parents are outside the U.S. and have waived reunification. There's 6 children in care who further review determined they were not separated. There's 1 child in care whose parents are in the U.S. and have waived reunification. So as of today, of the 2,814 children reported to the court, there's only 1 child left for whom the ACLU has advised the resolution of the parents' wishes will be delayed. We can't yet reunify that child. But those 2,814 children do not include all children who've ever been separated by the border and referred to ORR. It's only the number that were in care as of June 26th of last year, based on how the court defined the case. On April 25th, the court approved our plan to identify those children. So pursuant to those plans, teams of U.S. Public Health Service Commission officers reporting to me have completed manual review of every child who was referred to ORR after July 1st, 2017, and discharged by June 26th. We send those lists from HHS to CBP and ICE, who conduct their own file review. That completed information is provided to the ACLU as part of a rolling delivery of lists ordered by the judge. And to date, the federal interagency has provided the ACLU with 3 lists comprising 981 possible children of potential class members. The judge has given us until October 25th to identify all the children, and I anticipate with great confidence that we will meet his deadline. Our mission is a child welfare mission. We seek to serve the best interest of each child. In almost all cases, the best interest of a child is to be with their parents or their family. That guides us in our work every day in the UAC program and in the reunification of separated children. We've done our best as a department to achieve that goal. Thank you. I'm glad to answer any questions you have for me.
Thank you, Commander. We'd be happy to hear from you, Mr. Edlow, at this point.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and other distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this additional opportunity to speak with you today regarding the Department of Justice's role in the zero-tolerance prosecution policy. Congress has directed that certain violations of our nation's immigration laws should be subject to criminal sanction. The Department of Justice's law enforcement role applies no less to these immigration crimes than it does to other categories of offenses. The current immigration system faces numerous challenges. Nationwide immigration enforcement is being dictated by court orders rather than by sound policy choices via rulemaking or congressional action. Exploitation of our asylum laws and the unaccompanied alien children provisions of the TVPRA have compounded these challenges and left the federal government with even fewer viable options to address our ever-growing crisis along the border. This administration has emphasized border security and immigration enforcement. Section 13 of President Trump's Executive Order 13767 directed the Attorney General to establish guidelines and allocate resources to ensure that federal prosecutors accord a high priority to prosecutions of offenses having a nexus to the southern border. In fulfillment of that order, on April 11, 2017, then Attorney General Sessions issued a memorandum to all federal prosecutors outlining certain immigration-related offenses, including improper entry, as high priorities for prosecution. On April 6, 2018, then Attorney General Sessions issued the memorandum entitled Zero Tolerance for Offenses under 8 U.S.C. Section 1325A. That memorandum directed federal prosecutors along the southern border to adopt, to the extent practicable, and in consultation with the Department of Homeland Security, a zero-tolerance policy for all offenses referred for prosecution under Section 1325A by the Department of Homeland Security. That memorandum remains in force today, and illegal or improper entry, among other immigration crimes, remains a prosecution priority for the Department of Justice. Neither the executive order nor Department of Justice directive called for nor created a policy of family separation. The Department of Justice does not dictate which cases are referred by the Department of Homeland Security for prosecution, nor does it maintain a general exemption from criminal liability for parents. The Department of Justice also has no operational or logistical role in either the care or processing of aliens for removal, regardless of whether they are adults or minors. And I will note that the President issued an executive order on June 20th, 2018, that directed the Department of Homeland Security, to the extent permitted by law and subject to the availability of appropriations, to maintain custody of alien families together during the pendency of any criminal improper entry or immigration proceedings involving their members. Criminal proceedings are separate from administrative immigration proceedings, and prosecution for illegal entry does not foreclose an alien's ability to make a claim to remain in the United States. As the issue of family separation and reunification has reached the federal courts, I may be limited in my ability to speak to certain issues today, either because they are currently in litigation or because they are more properly directed to another agency that the department represents in litigation. The Department of Justice stands ready to work with Congress to improve existing laws to avoid a reoccurrence of the present situation and to respond to the challenges that our immigration system faces. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Finally, but not least, Ms. Shaw will be pleased to hear from you.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss DHS OIG's recent work on conditions at Customs and Border Protection facilities at the southern border. My testimony today will focus on our two recent management alerts regarding dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention observed by DHS OIG inspectors at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center in May of this year, and at facilities in the Rio Grande Valley in June. We issued these alerts because the conditions we observed posed a serious and imminent threat to the health and safety of DHS personnel and detainees. DHS OIG conducts unannounced inspections of CBP facilities to evaluate compliance with CBP's transportation, escort, detention, and search standards, otherwise known as TEDS standards. TED standards govern CBP's interactions with detainees, providing guidance on things like duration of detention, access to medical care, access to food and water, and hygiene. Our unannounced inspections enable us to identify instances of noncompliance with TED standards and to propose appropriate corrective action to the department. Although CBP has struggled at times to achieve full compliance with detention standards, our recent unannounced inspections revealed a situation far more grievous than any our inspectors previously have encountered. For instance, when our team arrived at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center, they found that the facility, which has a maximum capacity of 125 detainees, had more than 750 detainees on site. The following day, that number had increased to 900. At all Border Patrol facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley, we also observed serious overcrowding among unaccompanied alien children, or UACs. Additionally, we found that individuals, including children, were being detained well beyond the 72 hours generally allowed under the TED standards and the Flores Agreement. For instance, at the Centralized Processing Center in McAllen, Texas, many children had been in custody longer than a week. Some UACs under the age of 7 had been in custody for more than 2 weeks. Under these circumstances, CBP has struggled to comply with TED standards. For instance, although all facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley had infant formula, diapers, baby wipes, and juice and snacks for children, 2 facilities had not provided children access to hot meals, as is required, until the week we arrived. Additionally, children at 3 of the 5 facilities we visited had no access to showers, limited access to a change of clothes, and no access to laundry facilities. Space limitations also affect single adults. The lack of space has restricted CBP's ability to separate detainees with infectious diseases, including chickenpox, scabies, and influenza, from each other and from the general population. According to CBP management, these conditions also affect the health of Border Patrol agents, who are experiencing high incidence of illness. Further, there is a concern that the overcrowding and prolonged detention may be contributing to rising tensions among detainees. A senior manager at one facility in the Rio Grande Valley called the situation, quote, a ticking time bomb. Despite these immense challenges, we observed CBP staff interacting with detainees in a professional and respectful manner, and in general, attempting to comply with the standards to the extent possible. Notwithstanding these efforts, Border Patrol requires immediate assistance to manage the overcrowding in its facilities. CBP is not responsible for providing long-term detention, and CBP facilities like those we visited are not designed to hold individuals for lengthy periods. However, with limited bed space available at ICE and HHS long-term detention facilities nationwide, detainees are left in CBP custody until a placement can be found. In its response to our recent management alerts, DHS described the situation at the southern border as, quote, an acute and worsening crisis. Our observations comport with that characterization, which is why we have called on the department to take immediate action to begin to remedy the situation. DHS OIG will continue to monitor and report on the situation at the border. In the meantime, however, the department's leadership must develop a strategic, coordinated approach that will allow it to make good on its commitment to ensure the safety, security, and care of those in its custody. I thank you. This concludes my testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And before I begin the questioning, I want to thank Ms. Lofgren for assuming the chair in my absence. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with the zero-tolerance policy and its implementation. Chief Hastings, as part of our investigation and document request into zero tolerance, the Department of Homeland Security has given the committee documents which detail allegations of how Family Border Patrol did family separations. Among these documents, the department produced a chart of 850 complaints made to the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, reporting family separations between October 2017 and June 2018. These documents are startling. The records we received detail separations of 12 children aged 1 year old or younger and 124 children under the age of 5. Even more surprising, of the 12 children under the age of 1, 9 of those separations occurred before the Trump administration enacted its zero-tolerance policy. In many cases, family separations happened without warning and without giving the children a chance to say goodbye to their families. Many were not told where their families were being taken. For example, in May of 2018, a 14-year-old boy being held at the Rio Grande Valley Processing Center was, quote, separated from his father after a meal break while in custody and was told that his father would be deported, close quote. An 11-year-old was, quote, called aside by an officer and then he did not see his father again, close quote. Another child at only 7 years of age describes being separated from her father, quote, in the place where it was cold, unquote, and that she did not understand why she could not see or talk to her father. Chief Hastings, are these tactics how Border Patrol agents were told to implement the zero-tolerance policy?
Chairman, we sent over some documentation that you had asked the Secretary for prior, as far as the interim guidance that we follow currently for separations, and those are similar to what we followed before the zero-tolerance policy.
Are these tactics that I just outlined, actual cases, how Border Patrol agents were told to implement the zero-tolerance policy, yes or no?
I don't know what tactics you're referring to.
I just read them. Were you listening?
I was listening, sir.
So then answer the question.
Sir, I've given you what we follow as far as guidance for separation. 88% of those are criminals.
So I will take it that when we find the names of the people who did this, they will be disciplined for not following policy.
They were following policy to the best of my knowledge. I'm not hearing where
They
they
did
weren't
what I
following
said.
policy.
They were not following the policy that you just outlined.
I don't know the individual specifics in
Were
each
Border
one of those
Patrol
cases.
agents instructed by your agency to trick children so they could take their mother or father away from them while they didn't know that was happening?
No.
Did Border Patrol receive any training on how to do this?
We have training about how family separation, and we've put out the guidance as you have seen.
If these reports are not an accurate description of how separations happened, can you please share how they did occur?
Again, I'm not specific to I don't know the specific issues that you're talking to about the 8
Well, how were
prior
they
to the
supposed to
zero-tolerance.
occur?
Pardon me?
How were they supposed to occur? How were children supposed to be separated from their families?
So the mother and father are informed prior to the separation.
You didn't answer the question. How is it supposed to happen? The mother and father are informed, and the kids, how is it supposed to happen? The mother and father is informed that at some point today, your kid is going to be taken away. In the middle of the night, someone comes and snatches the kid. I take it that's not what is supposed to happen. What is supposed to happen?
So we would inform the mother or father of the charges and the reason, and provide them the time to say goodbye to the child.
The charges and the reason and the time in advance.
Yes.
How far in advance?
It's going to vary depending upon the situation.
Vary from what? Hours, minutes, seconds?
I don't know what specific one you're talking to. but
What's the minimum
generally
time?
Don't have a minimum time.
So it could be 10 minutes.
Could be.
If you were choosing to deport parents without their children, how can the Trump administration claim there was a plan to reunify?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear you.
If you were choosing to deport a parent without the children, how can the Trump administration claim there was a plan to reunify the family?
Because when we started this, we would place the A number and all of the information of the adult or the child on all of the paperwork so there could be reunification after the adult went through the appropriate legal action.
After the adult was deported, was the child supposed to be after it was determined that the adult was being deported, was the child supposed to be returned to the parent before the deportation, or the parent is suddenly in some foreign country and the child is here?
It's probably a better question for HHS.
Who did the deportation?
We would do the deportation.
You would do the deportation while the child was in a different city in the United States?
We don't do the reunification, is my point, sir.
But you would do the deportation before the reunification without any knowledge of whether the parents are being reunified?
Yes.
So in other words, you're kidnapping the child.
Not kidnapping the child. We
characterize
follow the
it.
guidelines that are out.
Deporting a parent without their child is literal kidnapping. The documents produced to the committee also reveal that vulnerable children, such as those of tender age or those with disabilities, were not given special accommodations or consideration in these facilities. For example, CPP separated a deaf-mute child from his father. The The DHS database was not updated to reflect the child's special needs and did not record that the child had been separated from his father. Another report described a 10-year-old with developmental delays who separated from his mother. No special effort was made to help him communicate with his parents. Chief Hastings, from these reports, it appears that Border Patrol placed little to no consideration into the physical and psychological needs of children when separating them from their family. In what ways, this is my last question because my time is over, did CBP consider the risks of these vulnerable children, of taking these vulnerable children from their parents and keeping them in CPP facilities? What special arrangements were made for children with these kinds of, who are deaf or mute or whatever?
So I'm not familiar with the two cases, but normally when we have incidents like that, we would alert HHS to the special needs.
You would alert HHS to the special needs before you gave the child to them?
Sir, we're a short-term hold facility. We're trying to get the children into the proper care as
And let me
quickly as
just read
possible.
one thing. Contrary to what you said, we have case reports here, just one line. On May 16, 2018, after a meal break while in custody, she was told by officers that her father would be deported, and she didn't see him again. That's the way these things were done. It's inhuman and un-American. I yield back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would help the witnesses to understand you're going to be here a little bit longer today because it's now my understanding that each member is going to have 7 minutes to question.
That's an incorrect understanding.
Well, is the chairman just going to continue to violate the 5-minute rule? Parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will proceed.
Well, I'm glad you're back because as you related to me in answering my questions, you really didn't answer my questions from my opening statements. Holding hearings until a problem is solved is about like saying I'm going to scream at that wall till it changes color. It's not going to happen. So you can come back here and you can, be very, very direct with our CBP agent who's here and give out of context situations in which people were detained without going through the actual determination of how they're actually determined right now. A separation occurs under these conditions, which were actually under the Obama administration and the Trump administration, said if a determination is made that the parent or legal guardian poses a danger to a child, is otherwise unfit for care for a child, has a criminal history, has a communicable disease, or is transferred to a criminal detention setting for prosecution for improper entry, or the CBP is unable to confirm that the adult is actually the parent or legal guardian, or the child's safety is at risk. If you're advocating to keep that child in those conditions, then maybe we have a whole different issue. And then to go back to we haven't done anything, I'll stand by exactly, and you can explain to this, Mr. Chairman, you can explain to the members here in the audience why the Ruiz bill is simply, again, we've talked about it, is not solving the underlying problem. Treating them well and having good conditions is something we would all agree upon, but the bill was so broad, so out of context, and applied to everywhere in the Customs and Border Patrol areas, not just the southern border, which is where we're having this issue, which made it impractical in many ways. This is the issue we're dealing with. So you can come back and try to correct me, but you've done all you did this morning, and even your line of questioning confirmed what we know. That this is simply another way to, as we mention it every time, Trump administration, we mention it every time, we don't talk about what actually is happening and why they're being separated. And if you want to keep kids with unfit parents, you want to keep kids who are actually been bought and paid for and brought across the order, then if that's what you're advocating, then maybe we need to talk about something different. But here's the issue, and I know it seems to be you're frustrated, this has been a long week. But this isn't helping. And to say you're going to hold hearings until the problem is solved, that probably caps this week. That just probably, just comes to the point of capping this week. We're going to hold hearings. We're going to talk about it. It reminds me of when my kids were little and they were going to hold their breath till I gave them their way. We're just going to sit here and hold and hope and hope and hope. Look, put bills in this committee that actually affect the underlying aspect, which the Obama administration talked about the Flores decision. We've talked about the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. We have talked about asylum standard. What we want to do, though, is talk about what's going on at the border, which we've already done many times. And I'm not saying this oversight shouldn't be done. We are, and we're holding accountable our Border Patrol, our ICE agents. We're holding that because we've had multiple hearings about it. But at a certain point in time, hearings don't solve problems, bills do. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad that you came back and answered me, but you didn't answer. In fact, well, let me rephrase that. You did. You showed that we're not interested in solving the problem. Because if you believe truly that hearings will solve problems, then I have maybe a basic misunderstanding of how a bill becomes a law. Because what would happen is you have several of these hearings, which we've had, You've had a lot of people here who are interested, and I'm sympathetic with the audience being here to be interested in this. But what are we giving them? Nothing, except a hearing, tweetable moments, press releases. This is what we're doing. This committee's better than this. There are great members on both sides who have legitimate arguments for bills. I have listened passionately to my members on the other side, and sitting in front of me and on down the dais, who have ideas about this, but we're not bringing the bills to a markup. Now, it could take 3 or 4 or 5 days or even 2 weeks to have these markups, but so what? Are these kids and these families not important enough on the border? Or is it just better to have another hearing that doesn't solve anything? Now, you can justify it any way you want to. You can say you passed a bill last week that actually, has standards. That's great. Again, any logically look at it would say it's overbroad and could have been supported by bipartisanly until we added in things that were unworkable. By the way, we didn't talk to the Border Patrol before we actually did the bill to see how we could actually put this in implementation. I guess that's a small oversight. But again, I'm not sure why both sides are even continuing to show up at these hearings, except to be used as props. The 5 of you are here. You're really technically going to testify to nothing. Some of you are back again, as we said, Mr. White and others are back again. Some of you are back again replacing somebody who was here earlier. You're not going to, Mr. Hayes, you're just testifying somebody who was here earlier. You're not going to say a lot. There's neither we don't know. We all know there's a crisis. We at least all now at least come to the conclusion there is a crisis. But it is, as I said before, using the words of the ranking member of the subcommittee, it is dehumanizing to sit here and do this and not solve a problem. And as was said about the administration, a competent and capable administration would have solved this. A competent and capable committee would have put bills forward instead of doing this. So again, spin it however you want to. This is what you want to do, go for it. But do not tell these people in this audience the disingenuousness that you're fixing something. Don't try it. They may buy it for a few minutes. Some of them have been buying it for 7 months. But they're not going to buy it forever. Pretty soon, they're going to ask, when can you have honest debate? You've got more numbers than I've got. You can put bills up here, and you can pass them because you're the majority. But we're not even doing that. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you answering the question or attempting to, but instead, you made my point. Crank the press release, get the Twitter going, talk about it before, but this is where we're at. This is the problem. For those of you who are here hoping for an answer, you're not getting it. If you're hoping for a show, you're getting it. But if you want an answer, I'm sorry. Both the Republicans and Democrats right now are not able to give you that answer, whether you like the answer or not. Maybe it's time we start going back to doing legislation that actually addresses the problem that the Obama administration and the Trump administration have both pointed out. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California, the chairperson of the Immigration Subcommittee, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think it's important to take a look at what is going on in the facilities run by the Department of Homeland Security and to determine whether they meet the standards that Americans expect of them. The ranking member's rather extravagant comments that somehow this doesn't matter, that it's abusive to us, I think are unwarranted. We did receive, as the chairman has indicated, documentation from the department itself outlining complaints that were made by the Office of Civil Rights in DHS about what was going on in these facilities. For example, one of the allegations is an 8-year-old boy who was separated from his mother. And then his report was that CBP officers kicked him and hit him with a shoe when he was sleeping in order to wake him up, that he was physically hurt by this. I assume, Chief Hastings, that that is not considered acceptable behavior on the part of your officers, kicking and hitting children?
No, ma'am, kicking and hitting children are not, but what I would imagine that was a check to make sure the individual was okay. We do those checks and go through periodically and make sure that the individuals in their custody are okay.
So you would kick a child to see if he's okay?
No. May tap his shoe, or may shake the child lightly to see if they're awake and check to see how they're doing, frankly.
There are, as I say, hundreds of reports from the department itself of misconduct, there's no other way to describe it, in the treatment of children by Border Patrol agents. I do not mean to say that every Border Patrol agent is engaging in misconduct, obviously not. I have met many Border Patrol agents who are going the extra mile to try and help people out, and I honor them for their efforts. But when there are reports or allegations of misconduct, what steps does the Border Patrol take to investigate these allegations, and how frequently are investigations opened into these reports?
So all allegations are taken seriously. We have posters and signs in many of our stations, all stations, that provide numbers that the detainees can call and provide these complaints that they may have.
Well, that's not really the question. The question is, what is your department doing once those complaints are made to track them down and hold officers accountable if they're true?
So either OIG, the Office of the Inspector General, or our internal CBP OPR, Office of Professional Responsibility, will do the investigation upon each of those and provide the investigation to us or to members to follow through with.
All right. The OIG is actually taking a new look at that for us, so we'll look forward to her report on that. Commander Watt, I want to turn to you to discuss the intent behind the zero tolerance policy. The last time you testified here, and we do appreciate that, you noted that there were multiple meetings in the first half of 2017 with officers from DHS where the possible family separations were discussed. According to the documents provided to the committee, in July 2017, you sent out a memo dated on the 4th of July, which discussed how ORR would need an additional resources if the, quote, DHS deterrence model was employed. The deterrence model included DHS instituting family separations and a memorandum of agreement between ICE and HHS where fingerprints of all people in the household would be shared with ICE. And without objection, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that this memo be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Can you describe why it was called a DHS deterrence model?
Yes, ma'am. We used a number of different models of possible future scenarios to anticipate how many beds we would need.
Okay.
We constructed a deterrence model in part as part of my effort to convince HHS leadership that separating children would not be possible for us to support operationally, that we would never have the funding or the beds to do it, because I believe that was an important part of the argument against separation.
Right. Can you tell us who those ideas were, who in the department discussed those ideas with you?
I discussed these issues primarily with the leadership to whom I reported. That was then Director of ORR Scott Lloyd, then Acting Assistant Secretary for the Administration of Children and Families Stephen Wagner, and then Counselor to the Secretary for Human Services Maggie Wynn.
Thank you very much. I would just note, Mr. Collins was dismissive of these efforts, but we did get a report from the OIG, the Inspector General, in September of 2018 that noted that so-called pre-verbal children, children who couldn't speak, were separated from their parents without a picture taken of them, without a fingerprint taken of them, without any kind of identification or bracelet put on them, simply removed. So to say that this is an unnecessary exercise, that everything's dandy, that we just need to pass a bill, I don't think you need to pass a bill to say don't destroy families at the border with callous disregard. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you. Chief Hastings, I appreciate your department's efforts in the face of such massive vilification. I know a great many of Border Patrolmen, and those men and women are not appreciated. The huge, huge majority are doing a thankless job. Director Hayes, I want to say thank you and your department for the efforts in bringing down the outrageous 92-day or 90-plus day average of detention during the during the previous years, down to 42 days. I appreciate the attempted, or the response, the class response that each of you have had during vilification of yours and your employees' efforts to be humane and yet enforce and follow the law. Even being castigated for having cages and things like that that were constructed by the Obama administration. It's deeply saddening that there was none of this vilification for inappropriate and outrageous conduct that occurred during the Obama administration. It seems to be all newfound now that there is a different administration that happens to be part of the Republican Party. And I just can't help but reflect historically, having served in the United States Army at a time that was very unpleasant to be in the military, when we were often ordered not to wear our uniforms off post because of violence against military members. I didn't know if we would see a day when people would be proud of service members and proud of first responders again. But one of the results of the horrible evil that occurred on 9/11 was how Americans came together afterwards, and people began to appreciate first responders in our military. It was incredible, the transformation. But during the last administration, we saw law enforcement being vilified over and over and over again. And the president himself was immediate to jump on a side before he knew the facts, and he was usually wrong on which side he attempted to defend. And as a result, we have been seeing attacks on law enforcement, attacks on people who are trying simply to do their job, protect the country, protect people. Serve and protect is a motto, and it's become outrageous again what's happening. Chief Hastings, let me ask you, in the emergency bill that's been touted that the majority passed, how much of that money came to your department to help you provide additional and better services?
Thank you, sir. So $1.1 billion came to our department. The majority of that is for soft-sided facilities, and for facilities due to the influx that we're seeing.
Did that allow you to hire any more people to handle the dramatic increase we've had crossing our border?
No, sir.
So you're still that limited in your personnel in carrying out your job?
We are seeking assistance in 2020 to begin with a prosecution assistant, basically, that would help us provide some of the support for the detainees that we're seeing, who we currently, right now, have DHS volunteers and other volunteers from other agencies assisting with now during the surge. What I'm talking about is feeding, caring, transportation, hospital watch, those types of duties.
Well, I know the immigration chair referenced that we need to allow the Border Patrol to get back to their primary duty of protecting the border. I've spent so many nights on the border I don't see your Border Patrol agents protecting the border. They're required not to protect it, but just in process everybody that comes through. I would think protecting would mean you protect the border from people coming in illegally. There is none of that, is there?
Our agents are frustrated right now. We have, you've heard before, 40 to 60% of our agents in RGV El Paso and even in Yuma who are doing the humanitarian mission and the care and feeding primarily. And we know that the border security mission is being affected. We know that.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman.
Yeah, and just to note, the chair has been gravely unfair. You said yesterday no one's above the law, but to be clear, the chairman is above the rules.
Mr. Gomert, I took 6 minutes and 38 seconds. Mr. Collins took 6 minutes and 40 seconds. You just took 5 minutes and 45 seconds. We're trying to get back at the request of the minority toward 5 minutes, which is why I didn't stop you at 5 minutes. And it's all at the discretion of the chair in any event. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hayes, Director Hayes, you're the permanent director now, are you not?
Yes, sir, Congressman, I am.
And when did you become the permanent director?
March 3rd.
And you became the temporary director after the previous director he resigned?
He transferred to a different department or division within the Department of Health and Human Services. That was late November of last year, sir.
And when did you come to the department?
Came to the department in mid-June of 2018.
And before that, what was the largest number of people you had ever administered as a administrator?
As a supervision, it would be here on the Hill, sir. Congressional staff.
What was that job that you had before you went over there?
I was the chief of staff.
Chief of staff for a congressperson. Was that Ms. Lesko?
No, sir.
Who were you the chief of staff?
Prior, I was chief of staff to Congressman Trent Franks and Congressman Steve Sutherland.
Steve Sutherland, remind me who he is.
He's from the Florida Panhandle, sir.
Florida Panhandle. Okay. That's not okay. Thank you, sir. So
You're welcome, sir.
This department needs somebody who has experience in running major agencies, who has experience and not political background. And I'm afraid that's part of the problem we have. But Congressman Escobar knows so much more about this subject. She's on the front lines. I want to yield my time to her and appreciate, I yield.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Just for the record, El Paso, Texas in 2017 was the testing ground for family separation. And so, unfortunately, I think that there are far more children who had been ripped from the arms of their parents than Americans even begin to realize. I think the numbers are much higher. I think we, as a country, have damaged an entire generation of Central American children. And this abhorrent policy, unfortunately, continues to this day. Chief Hastings, you mentioned that family separation is a rare occurrence. You were referring to separation between a biological parent and a biological child. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
So to many of us, a family actually is a much broader definition than a biological parent and a biological child. To many of us, family is a grandparent, a grandchild, an aunt or uncle, and a niece or nephew, siblings, etc. Chief, and actually before I begin my questioning, I feel like I have to say I do not believe that Border Patrol agents are bad. Chief, you and I were in a meeting where I expressed my gratitude to the many really great agents who are working hard and are overwhelmed, but there is no doubt that there are some really bad agents as well, and it's important that we root out those who dehumanize migrants so that those who don't feel that way don't feel despondent. But isn't it true, Chief, that we are still separating families today, children who are taken from the grandmother who is separated from a grandchild, for example? Isn't that still occurring?
So we are following the definition by TVPRA, and the definition is a parent or legal guardian.
So a grandmother who enters with a grandchild, they are being separated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that child then becomes an unaccompanied minor. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Also, you said in your testimony that, quote, our laws also prohibit the removal of individuals to countries where they face a likelihood of torture. But we know that people are being forced into Mexico even when they have a credible fear of being there, and they have expressed it to Border Patrol, but Border Patrol is forcing them anyway, and at that point, in what is a violation of both Section 241b3 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, as well as the principle of non-refoulement under international law. In my district, in El Paso, we know that over 11,000 people, many of them families, are waiting in Mexico for their asylum hearings. We know of a specific case, for example, where 2 young families were returned to Ciudad Juarez, and while running errands, their fathers were kidnapped, beaten, and then released. These families had to fight hard not to be returned. Chief Hastings, why is Border Patrol violating U.S. and international law by forcing people to wait in Mexico when they have expressed a credible fear of residing there, or they have, in fact, experienced kidnapping, rape, or other violence?
So, ma'am, are you referring to MPP, or are you?
Yes.
Okay, so with MPP,
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Who's next? Yeah, the witness can answer the question, I'm sorry.
with MPP, if the subjects do claim fear, we take them to CIS. CIS will determine if there's fear. If there's fear determined, then they'll go through the asylum case. If they don't claim fear, they will be returned to Mexico under the Mexican Protection Program, MPP.
And just for the record, we have innumerable examples in El Paso, Texas, where they have claimed fear and they've been returned anyway.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Hastings, do you receive combat pay when you come to the Hill?
No, sir.
Well, you should. How long have you been with Border Patrol?
A little over 24 years, sir.
Are you what's considered a career official?
I'm a career law enforcement official, yes, sir.
Well, thank you for your service, first of all. And second of all, you have served under approximately how many different administrations?
3 or 4, sir.
And have you seen any of those administrations target children for hostile activity?
No, sir.
Have you ever heard of an administration ordering the Border Patrol to kidnap a child?
No, sir.
Did you hear the chairman's opening statement?
I did, yes, sir.
Did you hear the story about a 3-year-old being forced to choose between 2 parents?
I did.
Have you heard, let me ask it this way. Are you aware of that incident?
I am. So if I understand that incident, I think we actually looked into that at the request of I'm not sure if it was a committee or the chairman, but in this specific incident, the child was not asked to choose if he was going to return with a father or mother. That was while they were in custody. We did not have a dual head of household holding cell, so he was asked, would he rather stay with his father or mother while he was in Border Patrol custody? He was ultimately reunited with his entire family and sent back to Mexico under the MPP program. So there was no child separation.
Okay. So one parent wasn't deported, as the chairman indicated. One parent wasn't deported, and another parent kept in the country, and the child had to choose between whether to leave with the deported parent or stay in the country.
That was which cell he went to while he was in our custody. He returned to Mexico with both parents.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think it's important. If we're not going to deal with facts, if we're going to start tearing at heartstrings, let's make sure that the underlying facts are, or at least the stories are accurate before we start talking about those particular incidents. Chief, are you aware that the human smuggling business in Mexico, Guatemala, the Northern Triangle, is a multi-billion-dollar business?
Yes, and it's thriving right now.
And what does it mean to be a multi-billion-dollar business? In other words, who's making that money? Are they legal agencies making that money, or are these cartels and illegal organizations?
So it's illegal organizations, transnational criminal organizations that are profiting on the backs of the people who are coming today.
And when you say on the backs of, have you heard of, have you read intelligence reports where there are instances of children being purchased so that individuals can enter this country illegally?
Yes, children are treated, and all aliens are treated as a commodity, frankly, with no care to their personal safety. And we see this time and time again. I've testified before. We see kids put on pool toys by smugglers and crossed across the Rio Grande Valley, the Rio Grande River. And then when our agents try to make an interdiction or assist, we see smugglers kick the kids off of these toys so they can make a safe getaway back to the south or to the Mexico border. But essentially, little care to no care for those that they're smuggling.
Okay, and is this a result of a policy that, a recent policy from the Trump administration, and when I say is a crisis at our border, is the treatment of young people a result of a policy from the Trump administration, or is it just a fact that the surge in immigration have left the facilities overwhelmed?
The facilities are overwhelmed by far. Our facilities were not built for this type of demographic that we're seeing today. They were built for the demographic of primarily returning quickly to Mexico. They weren't built for what we're seeing today. They're short-term facilities. They're not meant to hold long-term.
And I have to tell you something. I have heard the testimony from the Inspector General's office. I agree that there are serious problems, and we've got to address those serious problems by increasing the facilities, increasing personnel, and also changing our law so we don't incentivize this kind of surge. But to blame Border Patrol or this administration for what's happening is shameful. And I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Hastings, is your testimony that human smuggling on the border is $1 billion per year business?
Yes, it is.
Where'd you get that information from?
Because we hear intelligence reports and speak with those who come across the border.
That's what somebody has, that's what you've heard. Okay, I got you. But listen, do you have a Facebook account?
I do not.
And do you have a Twitter account?
I do not.
So it was recently revealed that there is a secret Facebook group made up of 9,500 current and former Border Patrol members. Are you aware of that secret group?
I have read the ProPublica report. Yes, sir, I'm aware.
And many of this group's Facebook posts have been racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, and dehumanizing. They targeted members of Congress, members of this committee, and also dead migrant children. In particular, the posts that callously made light of the death of a Guatemalan teenager at a border station in Texas. Those posts are truly despicable. Are you aware of those posts?
I am, sir, and those are inappropriate, and they're being investigated, and if found to be true, the appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. We've already provided cease and desist letters to all of those individuals that were on the post. Some have been relieved of their law enforcement duties as well.
Mm-hmm. How many of those individuals were on that post?
I know of approximately 50 cease and desist letters that have gone out, and I'm not sure, a handful more or less of administrative actions or administrative duties where agents are basically not doing law enforcement duties while they wait the outcome of the disciplinary.
I see. I'm particularly troubled by reports that CBP leadership knew about this secret Facebook group for years. Are you aware of that?
I've seen the reports, but I did hear Chief Provost testify yesterday, and I know that the chief, I think, mentioned she'd been on the Facebook 9 times in a year, and that was primarily, frankly, to search herself, to try and find out what the agents thought about how she was doing as a chief.
And you are familiar with the fact that she has actually posted on that secret Facebook group.
I've seen the article. I believe she posted one time in reference to a Jeopardy question that asked how quickly she had been a supervisor within Border Patrol or something to that effect.
And that's what you've heard, but you haven't talked with her.
I know yes, I have talked with her. She's in my chain of command, and I talk to her daily, but that's all I'm aware she's ever posted.
I see. Did she tell you that herself, or that's something that somebody else told you?
That's what I heard her say during her testimony yesterday, and that's what I've heard her say to me before.
Do these racist and xenophobic posts in that Facebook group concern you as a member of Border Patrol leadership?
They do. It's inappropriate, and we're taking the appropriate actions.
Now, let me ask you, and thank you, sir, Inspector General, Ms. Shaw. You testified before the Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee earlier this month that the Inspector General's office is looking into this secret Facebook group, correct?
That's correct. We're not looking at individual posts by individual members, but we are conducting a review to determine who within CBP and DHS leadership was aware of the group and the postings, when and what, if any, action they took.
And will you be looking to identify the current Border Patrol members involved in this group, and including additional members of Customs and Border Patrol leadership?
That's not currently within the scope. To the extent that we are looking at who within leadership was aware of it, it could come into scope, but primarily membership within the group and individual postings, I believe, is being handled by CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility.
And if you identify specific Border Patrol members where disciplinary action may be taken to, will you refer that to the CBP's Office of Responsibility?
We would, yes.
And what is the timeline for this investigation?
We're in very early stages. It is time sensitive. We would hope to be able to complete field work in 2 to 3 months and have reporting ideally before the end of the calendar year, but we have to follow the leads where they take us.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to say, I want to echo the sentiments that's been expressed by Ranking Member Collins, by Mr. Buck, and so many others. We just have extraordinary respect for the work that you all do in these agencies, and it's heroic and under extreme duress these days. And we're grateful that you come continually to answer these questions, even though, as has been expressed, we don't seem to be getting to many solutions. We want to do that. In light of that, let me ask you a couple of questions about the credible fear issue, and I'll ask Mr. Edlow these questions. But let me just say, for those who are taking notes, that the current threshold to establish credible fear is that the asylum applicant must be able to show significant possibility, that's the quote, of persecution if they return to their home country. One U.S. Supreme Court decision found that this threshold is satisfied if there is only a 10% chance of persecution. In fiscal year 2018, there were 99,035 total asylum applications, and DHS agents determined that under the current standards, 74,677 met the criteria. Of that number, only 16% of credible fear cases were actually approved later by immigration judges. It's abundantly clear the current credible fear threshold is contributing to the severe backlog of asylum cases in our immigration courts, and unfortunately, contributing to the delay of families who are legitimately fleeing persecution. So here's a question, Mr. Edlow. Do you believe that the unprecedented surge in family units crossing the southern border has exposed faults in the credible fear standard under our existing asylum laws?
Thank you, Congressman. The position of the department and frankly the administration is that the credible fear standard, along with other loopholes, has provided some impetus for the increase in crossings.
I think that bears with common sense. And let me ask you, do you believe it's possible that the current lax credible fear standard can act as a catalyst for southern border crossings that endangers these family units in the process?
Again, the administration has long said that illegal crossings do come with a great deal of danger. So anything that acts as a catalyst to do so would increase danger to families and to children.
The last Congress, numerous officials, including then Attorney General Sessions, Secretary Nielsen, Director Cisna, stated in response to previous questions that statutory changes are necessary to enhance the process of assessing what constitutes credible fear. Do you agree with them that the credible fear standard needs to be raised to ensure the protection for those that are truly fleeing persecution?
Congressman, I think any legislative changes the department would like to see, we would be happy to work with Congress in perfecting those changes and are willing to provide technical assistance as needed.
Grateful for that. I filed a bill to do that in the last Congress, made it through this committee bipartisan fashion, and Ranking Member Collins and I have filed it again. Would you speak briefly to the failure to appear rate in immigration court for non-detained family units?
Yes, I believe what you're referring to is what's been actually wrongly called a pilot program. From September until it's continuing, the Executive Office for Immigration Review has studied specifically the family units within 10 cities that are being, the cases that are being filed within 10 cities. Of those numbers, there's been about 64,000 cases that have been filed in those courts. Of the completed cases, there's been about 17,000 completed. Over 13,000 have resulted in an in absentia order, which would translate to about 80% of the total completed cases were completed with an in absentia order.
Thank you. I think we've got to work on that. Real quickly, I have about less than a minute left. Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that DHS is separating children where there is a potential danger to the child? I know this has been discussed today, but we just want to reiterate this for the record.
So in regards to any specifics, sir, I would defer to my colleagues at DHS, but I do know in the intakes process at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, we are informed of certain separations due to concern for safety of the child. Yes, sir.
We hear a lot about sex trafficking and the rest, and if a child comes across and is not easily identified to be with a parent, isn't it appropriate for us to take appropriate measures to protect the child, to separate that child from that adult? Doesn't that make sense to everyone?
I would defer that law enforcement-minded question to my colleague at DHS.
Would you follow up on that?
So 88% of those that we have separated so far this fiscal year have been for criminal or gang history. For the endangerment to the child, the best example I can give is about 2 or 3 months ago, we had a child cross with her father, immediately claimed that her father had raped her the night before in Mexico, and we separated that group.
It would be inhumane to do anything else. I yield back. Thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, during the committee's February 26th oversight hearing on the administration's family separation policy, I entered several documents into the record that were turned over by HHS detailing a high number of alleged sexual assaults on unaccompanied children in the custody of ORR. And since the February 26th hearing, I've been attempting to work with ORR to identify changes that need to be made to ensure the safety for unaccompanied children being held at facilities across the country. On April 22nd, ORR assisted in arranging a visit and tour of the Homestead facility, my second visit to the facility. The staff was accommodating during my visit. Tour was extremely informative. And following up on the tour, Director Hayes, following up on the tour, I sent you a letter on June 7th with several questions and requests for documents. I just received a response yesterday evening that my letter had been received. I'm grateful for that, and that the information was being compiled. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit my letter dated June 7th to Director Hayes for the record.
Without objection.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Director Hayes, during my visit to Homestead, the staff there confirmed that operating a facility like that costs 3 times as much as operating a permanent facility, and unlike temporary influx facilities, permanent facilities are subject to federal, state, and local laws meant to protect the welfare of children. So what I'd like to know, what I ask in my letter, and what I'd like you to tell us this morning is whether ORR is in the process of finding less expensive alternatives to facilities like Homestead for unaccompanied minors. And I guess fundamentally the question is are you in the process of closing the Homestead facility?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I want to first give you my commitment that we will respond to that letter just as quickly as we can. You're welcome, sir. I will say that, as I mentioned in my testimony, I want to thank you and the leadership of the House of Representatives for helping get the supplemental. One of the main priorities of myself, Assistant Secretary Lynn Johnson, and Secretary Azar is to absolutely increase the number of permanent state licensed beds available for receiving of children from Customs and Border Protection at HHS. That is something that we are equally committed to at both the political and the career leadership of ORR.
And do you have any information in the possibility of Homestead providing information on when the Homestead temporary facility will be shut down?
So as of this morning, sir, our census at Homestead is down to 829. We have not designated any additional children to Homestead since July 3rd, and we are in the process of drawing that down, given the higher discharge numbers that we're seeing, as well as the lower referrals coming across the board.
Let me ask you some questions that I asked in my letter, but perhaps you can answer them. The Homestead facility staff stated that General Dynamics has contracted with the facility to provide sexual abuse training, and I had asked for copies of the contract with General Dynamics and details regarding that curriculum. Is that something that you can provide to us quickly?
I don't know if I can divide it quickly, sir, but I'll certainly go back to our team and look into it.
In 6 weeks, so
okay.
it's no longer quickly, but if you could help with that, I'd appreciate it.
I will check into that, sir.
Also, the Homestead facility staff informed me that DHS OIG and Comprehensive Health Services include the Prison Rape Elimination Act, the PREA, and other standards in their contract provisions. We've been trying to get a copy of the contract between the government, and Comprehensive Health Services. We'd also like to see copies of the subcontracts just to see the extent to which those requirements are incorporated. Can we get copies of those contracts?
I will go back to the department and we will look into that, sir. If I may just add one thing, it's not just GDIT that does some of the oversight. There was also federal oversight. There was state and local official oversight. It's a very broad, multi-pronged approach.
There's state and local when they submit to them, which gets me to my last question.
Yes, sir.
The Homestead facility staff gave me a briefing about the database that keeps track, a national database that keeps track of every allegation and serious incident that occurs at that facility and throughout the country, every facility housing unaccompanied minors. It tracks when a staff person is fired. It tracks what happens when allegations are made. Can you provide the committee with information from the database on how many assault cases have resulted in the termination of an employee nationwide? How many were resolved in disciplinary actions? What disciplinary actions were taken against the staff person? And most importantly, how many cases of sexual abuse are being investigated and are ongoing nationally?
We will look at that letter, sir, and respond as quickly and as we are able. I will note for this committee's information that there are 3 different types of sexual misconduct. There is inappropriate sexual behavior, sexual harassment, and sexual abuse. And I will note that the number of actual sexual abuse is very small and most often involves children amongst children. But we will work to get to that information as quickly
right, as I said at our, Mr. Chairman, as I said at our last hearing, 1 case is too much.
I 100% agree, sir.
Right, and please don't try to make us feel better by suggesting that sexual harassment is somehow less objectionable, that we should tolerate sexual harassment.
That was not my intention, sir. We're in agreement.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Virginia.
Can you go to Biggs?
The gentleman from Arizona.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, Chief, you testified about the human trafficking business right now is in excess of $1 billion, maybe more than $2 billion. Is that fair?
It's fair, yes, sir.
And the gentleman from Georgia might have implied that your testimony about this was based on some intelligence reports, briefings, and he said, quote, "Oh, something you heard," close quote. An intelligence briefing is not just gossip between folks coming across the border illegally and agents. It's an intelligence briefing, I assume.
That's correct, sir.
Please describe what goes into an intelligence briefing.
So we have a multitude of intelligence agents working in the field who work closely with sources of information. work closely with those that come through our process in order to determine the amounts that individuals from different countries are being charged, how much they're being charged to be being smuggled into the U.S., and that's how primarily, in short, how we get the information of what they're being charged to be transited up illegally through the U.S. or into the U.S.
So you can make that testimony with some confidence in the intelligence briefings you received?
Yes, sir.
So we've been talking about family separation, and on the monitors before you and to the sides is what we call permanent family separation. Brandon Mendoza, Mesa City police officer, son of Marianne Mendoza, who is one of my constituents, was killed by an illegal alien who had been deported multiple times. They are permanently separated. Grant Runnebeck, that's Grant on the right. Grant was working as a clerk when he was shot in the face and murdered by another individual who had been here and deported multiple times, including having multiple felony convictions. This is permanent separation. If you want to solve separation, we would do more than have hearings, because there isn't anybody in this room that doesn't want to deal with the situations that are horrific along the border. We should fix Flores. We should allow for detention of family units for more than 22 days and extend it back to 45 days, allowing us hopefully to resolve their issue before the courts more quickly. We're down in Yuma not too many months ago. It's a facility designed for 250 people. When we were there, there were 750 plus, and last time I checked, they were over 1,200. It's a 12-hour facility. It's not a detention facility. It's a holding facility to process individuals and move them along in the system that is the most thorough due process giving system in immigration in the world. It is not because CBP is infiltrated with people who hate people. It is because the surge is so overwhelming to the system, the facilities. CBP found in an investigation that Charleston, South Carolina, and several other cities had the same sponsor for multiple individuals, 50 people going to the same address. In their investigation, they found that they had a cartel affiliate running a human trafficking ring, and when they went there to bust it, much to their surprise, they had the local LEOs, they had CBP, they had ICE, they had FBI involved. They found 3 small children there. They didn't even know about the children. They knew that the adults were being trafficked and basically treated like slaves. Well, these 3 children had been ceded over, either rented or sold to the drug cartels, the human trafficking cartels. They were able to get those children out of that situation. That person was charged. They report to me that there are literally hundreds of these rings in this country. Thousands of children are separated on a monthly basis by these human traffickers, and parents giving them that, moving them over to these traffickers. Conditions are terrible. We have to enact the laws and see enforcement and provide the resources necessary to resolve those issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say at the outset, Mr. Chairman, there was a lot of discussion from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about inaction by Congress. I would remind them that we have appropriated an additional $4.5 billion to address this crisis on the border. We passed legislation just yesterday to set standards for care for individuals who are in detention. We passed the DREAM Act and temporary protective status legislation, and today we will pass temporary protective status for Venezuela. Oversight is also part of our responsibility, so I invite my Republican colleagues to join us in some of the work of actually responding to this crisis. And I want to start with you, Ms. Shaw. You issued what are called management alerts. Is that correct?
Yes.
And a management alert is issued in this case because you found, and I quote, that you identified issues that posed a serious, imminent threat to the health and safety of CBP personnel and detainees, requiring immediate action by the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you detail those in your written testimony in considerable detail. Is that communicated to the Customs and Border Patrol?
The recommendation for immediate action?
Yes.
Yes, as part of our the first management alert, that was an official recommendation.
Okay. So Chief Hastings, have you read the management alerts that have been provided by the Office of Inspector General?
I have, sir, both.
Have you begun to develop a response to it?
Sir, we've been working prior to the reports coming out, and like I said, we've been saying for 8 months, we're over capacity.
But Chief, in particular, there's an acknowledgement that there is not a strategic coordinated approach to service, safety, security, and care for those in custody. Are you now developing a strategic coordinated approach to address these issues?
So we're constantly working on the capacity issues. As I testified in my opening, we had 6 off-site facilities that we had actually paid for to begin construction prior to even getting the supplemental, getting the funding for the supplemental.
So Chief Hastings, you made reference in your testimony to the implementation of the zero tolerance policy, which occurred on April 6th, 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was a new policy being put into place, correct?
That was a policy to increase our total overall prosecutions.
Okay, and that was a new policy?
It was.
So there wasn't a zero tolerance policy before April 6th of 2018, was there?
We had ran similar pilots in the field in other locations, but to that magnitude, no.
It was not a policy in place throughout the entire department, correct?
No, not before,
and it was,
to my knowledge.
Okay, and that policy required you to prosecute parents so that every child that was with a parent then became an unaccompanied child, correct?
Well, there was a list, and you've seen the list, but it started out with single adult criminals, went to single adults who were smuggling, and then went to non-contiguous family units.
Okay, so Chief, I want to talk specifically, I know a number of my colleagues have mentioned family separations at the southern border are ongoing. I want to discuss one very specific case with you, Chief. Due to the Trump administration's Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or Remain in Mexico policy, where migrants are required to wait in Mexico until they can have their asylum hearing, one Honduran family was told that they would be separated. One parent would stay in the U.S. with their children, and one would be sent to Mexico. According to the parents, a Border Patrol agent then asked the couple's 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, to choose which parent she wanted to stay with, ultimately deciding who would stay in the U.S. and who would go to Mexico. Asking a 3-year-old child to choose between their parents, not knowing if they'll ever see one again, is unconscionable and traumatic to a child. The separation occurred despite a medical recommendation from a doctor who advised that they be removed from MPP and stay together due to Sophie's severe heart condition. So Chief Hastings, my first question is, did this Border Patrol agent correctly implement MPP according to your policies?
So I believe that's the same case we were discussing earlier, where they were separated only in our facility and they were returned as an entire family unit back to Mexico.
My question, Chief, is even though that ultimately was the result because of some court intervention, is it an appropriate policy to ask a 3-year-old child to decide which parent will stay in the U.S. and which will not?
So that was based upon capacity and availability within our own short-term holding detention cells.
Chief, my question is not about your capacity. My question is the propriety and the damage you are doing to a 3-year-old child to ask them to make that decision, to pick a parent. Is that consistent with the MPP protocols?
Sir, the family was not separated. They were returned together.
You deny that the child was asked to pick a parent to stay with and which one would be deported?
While in our custody, there was no, to my knowledge, no deportation.
Are the medical and psychological conditions of minors considered before placing a family's case into the MPP program?
They are.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have smugglers and traffickers that take young children out of the Northern Triangle, subject them to a treacherous journey where they're abused physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and then they come to our country and what I've seen in HUMA sector is that we have Border Patrol agents who are doing everything they can to respond to a crisis that they did not create and that our laws continue to exacerbate. We have a crisis at our border because our laws themselves seem to be a humanitarian crisis. Instead of requiring migrants to show up with legal paperwork, we simply require them to show up with a trafficked child and present that child in lieu of legal basis to be in our country. And it's devastating to me that while we continue to have thousands of people that today will show up at our border under these conditions, that we're not taking action to reform our asylum laws. And they're sick laws. The crisis on our border was articulated by Secretary McAleenan at the beginning of the year. He begged for the resources to be able to help save lives. He begged for changes in our asylum laws so that we would not be encouraging people to cross our border illegally. Commander White, had the Congress responded timely to Secretary McAleenan's request for supplemental funding, rather than only passing it quite recently, how many migrants would that have impacted, and what would have been the effect of more prompt response to DHS's request?
I don't know any way I could answer that question. Is your question about what would be the effect had there not been a period of near deficiency in the UAC program?
Yeah, the question is so McAleenan asks for the money in February. We don't provide the money until very recently. And so that delta between the request and the provision of resources created some consternation for the health, safety, and welfare of people who were in our country illegally, and I'm trying to understand that dynamic.
I'm not aware of any impact that would have on the Mizell class, but to the extent that it might have an impact on the UAC program, I'll defer to that program's director, Mr. Hayes.
So, Congressman, yes, the lack of funding and the deficiency status that we entered into for a short season at HHS did create a level of uncertainty in the program, and in accordance with the Anti-Deficiency Act, there were some services that were affected as we carried out the mission to care for the children as they worked through the process. Now, how that would have any impact actually at the border?
No, I don't mean that. I mean for the conditions of people that the majority is focused on. So
I would defer, and I would defer part of that to.
No, I've got the answer to the question. Chief Hastings, my colleague from Georgia, I don't think gave you a full opportunity to answer the question about your basis for the belief that this smuggling industry was a billion-dollar industry. You referenced intelligence reports and intelligence collected off of those that were being trafficked, and he said, okay, well, you've just heard some things, and went on. Would you like to illuminate more thoroughly on how we know of the gravity and of the stakes of this trafficking crisis?
Yeah, so again, the smugglers are the ones who are profiting from all of this, the TCOs. But, I mean, I'd give 5 specific examples of this year we've had 200 large groups of over 100 hit our borders. We've never seen anything like that. Last year was 13, year before 2. Specifically, in an example, in at least 5 of those large groups, we had technology that provided us with information that large drug loads, usually cocaine or marijuana, were being trafficked at the same time. In other words, these large groups are often used as a diversion for drug trafficking organizations to know that when you're sending a group that large down through the border, you're effectively shutting down our operation so we can deal with that amount of people. In the meantime, you're running a large narcotic load through right next door, 2 to 3 miles away.
And that's, your agents refer to that as gap time, is that correct? Where there are gaps and where they can cover the border because they're having to process large volumes of migrants?
That's correct, where we either have to transport, detain, or in this case, effectively shuts down just due to sheer transportation and volume of getting those individuals medically assessed and back to our station in a timely manner to process.
Thank you. Well, I certainly hope we can get some of that bipartisan work product before the committee. Mr. Chairman, may I be recognized for a unanimous consent request?
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a McClatchy article, January 15, 2016, entitled, Obama Administration Fights to Keep Family Detention.
Without objection, the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the zero tolerance policy ended after a court decision, I understand that hundreds of children continued to be separated from their parents at the border, and unless someone corrects me, I believe they're still taking place to this day. On the criteria of either criminal history or best interests of the child. Is my understanding basically right, Chief Hastings?
That's correct. Guidance was put out immediately that basically identified when child separation would occur to the agents.
Well, can you tell us generally what the standard is there?
I can. It is a referral for a parent legal guardian for prosecution of a felony. Parent legal guardian presents a danger to the child. Parent legal guardian has a criminal conviction for violent misdemeanors or felonies. And then the parent or legal guardian has a communicable disease.
So I've gotten word of some disturbing stories of families being torn apart for reasons which appear not to fall within those categories, but I understand there's some generality and abstractness to the way that that memo is written. You're quoting from the June 27th, 2018 interim guidance. For example, if a child was separated from a parent because the parent had a marijuana arrest or conviction, would you see that as outside of this memo, or would you see that as an acceptable interpretation of this memo?
It'd be a case-by-case basis, and I would want to see all the facts of everything that was presented.
But assuming that there were no other salient facts offered, would it be enough that there was a marijuana conviction in someone's record?
Again, it would be case-by-case. I'd need the totality of the circumstances to make that decision.
Well, I mean, I understand it's case-by-case. That's how the justice system works. But we take case-by-case, and then we apply rules. And what I'm looking for is what is the rule that's to be applied on a case-by-case basis? Would a marijuana arrest or conviction fall within, I mean, it doesn't look like it's prosecution for a felony, and it doesn't look like it's a criminal conviction for a violent misdemeanor or felony. Wouldn't that fall outside?
Well, again, I would want to see the totality of the circumstances to see if there were other convictions, other things out there.
All right, so if you're in charge and you've got enormous experience, if you can't tell us, how is somebody, a line person in the Border Patrol supposed to make that determination? I mean, can one make a decision one way about a marijuana arrest and then another officer make another decision about a marijuana arrest?
If the agent has a questions, they will refer that through our legal counsel and work with our legal counsel to make sure they're making the right decision in accordance with this guidance that's been put out.
The National Immigration Justice Center represented a woman who I'll call Maria, who was separated from her 3-year-old for more than 3 months because Customs and Border Patrol thought that she had a criminal history in her home country. She was not reunited with her son until U.S. lawyers were able to obtain proof from El Salvador that she had no such record. What steps are taken to prevent mistakes and errors? Because the impact is obviously devastating on a family. None of us, I'm sure, can contemplate having a missing or lost child for more than 15 minutes, much less for 3 months.
Sir, I'm not aware of the specific case, but I'd be glad to look at it and get back to you.
But what's being done to prevent mistakes from being the basis for decisions?
So as I said earlier, separation is not taken lightly. We run every check, discuss, make sure to the best of our ability that we can by running all criminal records checks, working with other entities, sometimes even foreign law enforcement offices, to make sure that everything that we're told is true and correct, and to the best of our due diligence, make sure that we're doing things properly.
If a mother or father has HIV positive status, is that alone enough to justify separation from their child?
It is. It's a communicable disease under the guidance.
Because we have reports of people being separated from their kids on that basis. Is that what we mean by communicable disease? It's not communicable through ordinary contact.
That's the guidance that we follow.
And is that came from your legal counsel, or that came from the chief of Border Patrol, or where did that come from?
I'm not sure if that came from legal counsel. We just see that, I believe that's defined as a communicable disease.
Do you have a list of the communicable diseases?
Not with me, no, sir.
I mean, the flu is communicable. Would we separate parents from kids if a mom or dad had the flu?
We are not, sir.
Okay, I see my time is up. I yield back. Thanks.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Virginia. North Dakota, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish that and I agree with my colleague on what due process is and convictions and those types of things, and I do, but I also know that I've seen reports that up to 92% of the crimes in El Salvador don't go punished. And I'm not going to ask you, because you all work with those guys, work with those countries, and we're doing a lot. But this is more than just checking a clerk of court record in some of these countries. We're going to vote today on TPS status for an entire country. We wouldn't be doing that if everything was wine and roses down there. So I wish that their due process was where it was and that it was as absolute as that. And you could say, have you been charged? Have you been convicted of a crime? And that was the final inquiry. But I suspect it's a little more complicated than that. And you're dealing with people, and I mean, and oftentimes the level of the crime you pay in some of these countries is how big of a bribe you paid to get out of it. So I think the real world's a little different than how we are interacting with that. So I think that's an important point. But Mr. Edlow, we talk about family separation, we talk about all of these different things in asylum, but we have to start from the basis of that we actually have a law. And the law is, it's a federal crime under 8 United States Code 1325 to illegally enter the United States, correct?
That is correct.
And this wasn't added to the federal code under President Trump.
No, sir. Congressman, the 1325A was added back in 1952.
And this is unique for federal crimes because it's actually a misdemeanor for a first offense. And we don't typically, the federal government isn't really in the business of like prosecuting federal misdemeanors in other areas of the law, is it?
It would depend, I guess, on the crime that we're referring to. But I would note that with every administration, the Department of Justice has an attorney general. That attorney general sets priorities for prosecution.
And you'd agree one of the reasons, I mean, we're not locking a bunch of these people up if they get a misdemeanor conviction. I mean, we're better stewards of the taxpayers' dollars than that. We're deporting them and sending them back to where they go. And I'm not talking in these asylum cases. I'm just saying you get an illegal, whatever, they get convicted of a misdemeanor, and then we work through ICE and get a deportation order.
That would be, after the prosecution phase, they would be returned to the Department of Homeland Security for them to explore whatever relief they may have available or protection, and ultimately to get that relief or protection or to be removed.
And one of the reasons for this is to deter illegal entry, correct?
Well, Congressman, presumably when Congress enacted 8 U.S.C. 1325, one of the reasons was to encourage individuals to appear at the port of entry and to try to get admission at the port of entry, as opposed to trekking through the desert, through the river, whatever else, to make a very dangerous journey into the United States.
And there's another reason, too, because illegal reentry is no longer a misdemeanor. Illegal reentry of a previously deported alien is a felony, right?
Yes.
So in order to have, I mean, if we have bad actors who continue to go back and forth in dealing with that, we need a deportation order. I mean, that's actually an element of the crime the second time.
For illegal reentry, yes, an element would be the deportation order.
And so it's not only to defer the first track, but it's also to make sure that people understand that if you keep doing this and continue to do it more than once, the consequences get more significant.
That's correct, Congressman, but I would also say that in terms of one of the most important parts of prosecuting 1325A is to really get at what Mr. Biggs was talking about earlier with regard to the smugglers, the abuse of children that we're seeing across the border at this point. And I would note that in the last year, there has been a marked increase in prosecutions for both violent crimes and crimes against children prosecuted by the federal government along the border.
And at the same time in the last year, parents traveling with children aren't being referred for prosecution right now because of a executive order issued by President Trump?
Congressman, I would defer to the Department of Homeland Security as to who is being referred to the Department of Justice, but I believe that the injunction under Mizell and the executive order of June 20th is in effect and is being complied with. That said, Congressman, I would also note briefly that as it's been stated, that the policy is no longer in effect. The zero tolerance prosecution policy is still an active memo.
I guess that's my question. It seems, and this goes to what Mr. Gates is saying, it seems that we've created now, through attempts at compassion, an absolute incentive to bring children across the border because it's essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Again, I would defer to Department of Homeland Security as to how they're referring cases, who they're deciding to refer.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start by, since there have been so many calls from the other side that there hasn't been anything done, I wanted to quickly run through a timeline of what happened with the family separation policy. On March 6, 2017, former DHS Secretary John Kelly announced that DHS was considering separating children from their parents to deter migration. A few weeks later, because of massive outcry across the country, on March 29th, Secretary Kelly announced that no, DHS was not going to pursue family separation, and yet just a few months later, we learned that DHS secretly piloted family separation in the El Paso sector from July through November of 2017. In February of 2018, responding to reports that family separation was occurring in the El Paso sector, Ms. Lofgren and I sent a letter raising concerns with reports of family separation. That was circulated to my Republican colleagues, not a single one signed on. In April of 2018, the New York Times reported that DHS took more than 700 children from their parents between October 2017 through April of 2018. And then on May 4th, 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced Trump's zero humanity family separation policy, and he named the principal purpose of family separation as deterrence and to criminally prosecute people. I'd remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as they express their outrage that nothing has happened, that they actually controlled both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate and the White House, during this entire time that family separations was happening. The entire 2-year period that they had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, this was actually happening at the behest of the Trump administration. They did not join us in oversight or having signing on to a single letter to address the humanitarian crisis. And ultimately, it was actually a court order that ensured that children were reunited with their parents on June 26th of 2018. That court order happened. But at that point, nearly 3,000 children had been identified as separated just during that time of the case. Now, today we know that family separations are still happening. As Mr. Edlow said, zero tolerance policy is still an active memo. I believe that's what you said. So let me go to Chief Hastings. You mentioned earlier in your testimony, and I don't have the exact words, so I wanted to make sure I get this right, that you said something like, when we started, we were tracking A numbers. What did you mean by when we started? What point of time were you referring to?
So during zero tolerance, we had a tear sheet that went with the A number to list the family members. So when reunification would take place, that the child could be matched with the family easier.
Okay, and are you aware that on September 27th of 2018, the DHS Office of the Inspector General found that DHS was, quote, not fully prepared to implement zero tolerance or to deal with after effects?
So for Border Patrol, I mean, we're the arresters and set up for prosecution, so we were prepared.
Okay, and so, the report also said that DHS struggled to identify, track, and reunite families and provided inconsistent information to migrants, thereby creating communications issues with their children once they were separated. So somewhere between Border Patrol, ORR, ICE, the various agencies that were involved, we lost the data. Children were separated from their families. And I'd like to go to Commander White, the last time you were here, and thank you for your courage and your testimony, you testified that you warned 3 Trump appointees about the potential health risks of family separation more than a year before the policy became official. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. I gave my first warning to my superiors on the 15th of February 2017 after attending the first meeting that we had where that
February of
proposal
2017. Thank you.
Yes,
And you
ma'am.
also testified that the best available evidence shows that separating children from their parents, and this is your quote, entails very significant and potentially lifelong risks of psychological and physical harm. Is that correct?
That is an established scientific fact.
Thank you. And Commander White, would you agree that if a child welfare official observed children being forced to wear clothing stained with vomit for weeks, deprived of basic essentials like adequate food, water, clothing, medical care, and dental hygiene, and leaving infants and toddlers in the care of other young children, wouldn't child welfare officials remove children from that household?
Although I don't know if that occurred, there's no doubt that any competent child welfare professional would take such a step.
And yet, here we are, the U.S. government detaining children in those conditions. It is absolutely abhorrent, and I continue to be stunned. I thank you,
Gentlelady's time has
Madam Chair,
expired.
and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to echo the concerns of everyone here who has told horrendous stories of children being separated from their parents, of children in conditions that are unacceptable. And I think that we all share, put politics aside, we all share these concerns and want to move to address them. So I'm glad to hear the timeline that the gentlelady presented, letters of concern as early as the last Congress that were going on. I can't help but also note that additional legislation was pushed during that same time that would have fixed Flores, offered by my predecessor, Congressman Chairman Goodlatte. Both of his bills would have included a fix to the Flores problem that we're encountering. The administration, it's my understanding, while they have continued a zero tolerance policy, has put forward a memo opposing family separation. Is that my understanding?
Congressman, there was an executive order that opposed family separation, and that executive order is being followed, as is the injunction in the MSL litigation.
Thank you. I think we all want to see legislation pushed to address it, and we have seen some legislation move. One piece of legislation out of this committee, sponsored by Congressman Ruiz, that dealt with conditions at the border. There's another bill dealing with short-term detention standards. But there, you know, when I was in the state legislature for 16 years, we developed expertise in our specific areas. I was on the Courts of Justice Committee. I was on the Finance Committee, which dealt with tax policy. And when there was a tax question, when there was a bill to affect tax policy, that legislation went through the Finance Committee. And so I am concerned that not only is there, I'm pleased, first of all, to hear that there are legislative initiatives out there to address this issue, but I am concerned that these bills are not only being introduced, I'm glad to hear they're being introduced by members of our committee. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, introduced a bill dealing with immigration policy, but it was not sent here. The Committee of Jurisdiction has not gotten to review that bill. And we have people on both sides with significant expertise on those issues who want to weigh in, who want to help. We have staff with decades of experience who should be able to assist as we seek to make the best policies possible, the best pieces of legislation possible to come out of this committee, to come out of this Congress. The only way you're going to get solid A-plus pieces of legislation is to put them through the committees of jurisdiction. And so for Congresswoman Escobar's bill to be referred to a different committee, I think is going to result in a piece of legislation that is not as good as it could have been. And that's just to put it mildly. Let me ask Mr. Hayes, Director Hayes, we've heard a lot of discussion about the Homestead Influx Shelter. Did that influx shelter open during the Trump administration or the Obama administration?
Sir, the Homestead site was first chosen and the initial contract and operator chosen in December of 2015 in the last administration.
Was the contractor who operated the Homestead Influx Shelter selected during the Trump administration or the Obama administration?
It was chosen in December of 2015 in the last administration, sir.
Are the services offered to the children under this administration different than the services offered in the last administration?
No, sir.
And what has changed since it opened in 2016 until now?
Just the census has gone up and down, but basically the shelter remains very similar to the way it was.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Just a note, I appreciate his comments on jurisdiction. I remember many years ago when Henry Hyde was chairing the committee and we had an issue that related to an overlap between the Energy and Commerce Committee. And he said, you know, Democrats are our adversaries, but the Energy and Commerce Committee is our enemy. So there is that jurisdiction. I will note that the Homeland Security Committee has jurisdiction over personnel in the Department of Homeland Security, but obviously all the policy issues are our jurisdiction. I think the gentleman has identified a serious issue and wanted to acknowledge that. Now I would recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. As I listened to my colleague from Washington State describe the conditions of children and families, I initially thought that I was listening to a story about families in a distant land. I know many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have tried to make this issue a partisan issue, but it's not. This issue is really about, is America who we say we are? Do we treat people with dignity and respect regardless of where they come from? And do we treat them fairly? That's what this issue is about. It is not a partisan issue, and I would say that we better get back on track because the conditions and situations at the border is a loser. It's a loser for all of us. It is a loser for this nation, and we are better than what we are doing at the border. Chief Hastings, I know you have a tough job, but let me just say this. As a law enforcement agency, CBP plays a critical role in our national security mission. But I also know what it's like to have been given an unjust, improper, and impossible mission or order. And as opposed to CBP being able to stay in their lane and keep our nation safe, you're having to deal with overcrowding in facilities, deal with children, deal with families, long-term stays and detentions. That's not your mission. And so I just want to know, but since you have been given that charge, do your officers or agents receive any specific training in dealing with children or the treatment of children in detention?
Yes, we receive yearly, we receive TVPRA training and Flores settlement training as well. But specifically as far as child care training, no.
No medical training to deal with?
We do have, we've got over 1,200 EMTs that are trained. I think we're the largest, only behind the Department of Defense. So we do receive that as well as basic EMT for all of our officers and agents.
That's annual training, you said?
It is, yes, ma'am.
Have all of your officers or agents received the training to date?
I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't know what the status is.
Acting Secretary proclaimed that such training is a hard thing to comprehensively provide for law enforcement. Do you agree with that statement? And if so,
in the
why?
current crisis, any training is hard to provide right now because, as I said earlier, we've got 40 to 60% of our agents just dealing with the crisis, and border security mission is suffering. We've canceled leave. We've canceled a lot of task forces, pulled agents back from those, and those agents are specifically, it's all hands on deck. We've even canceled some training.
Acting Secretary also mentioned in his testimony that the department is hoping to have contracted experts in CBP facilities that can identify mental health trauma in children. Have you completed that?
So are you referring to the contract of medical assessment teams that we have in our facilities?
That's correct, but specifically dealing with mental health issues that children may suffer who are in your detention facilities.
So what I can say is we started with about 20 medical health professionals through a contract company in all of our southwest border facilities. We have over 200 today. We're expanding those medical contracts as quickly as possible to provide that initial assessment. Again, it's short-term, not long-term. So if a problem is identified, we'll seek to get the proper help as quickly as possible, not in the facility.
Ms. Shaw, during your visits to the various facilities, do you agree with that assessment? Is that what you saw, contracted professionals in place dealing with some of the challenges in the facilities?
So I can't share specifics as of yet. We're working on our capping report, which will address what we saw. We do observe volume of medical staff on site. I can tell you that we did see staff on our visits, some from Coast Guard, some from other agencies, to provide help under the circumstances.
And finally, Chief Hastings, if a medical emergency does occur, could you just kind of walk us through? I know there was some discussion in the past that there weren't even medically trained personnel even close to a lot of the crises or medical crisis that you interacted with in the field. Could you kind of walk us through how things have gotten better?
As I said earlier, we now have over 200 medical nurse practitioners and physician's assistants in our facilities through the contract. If they identify an issue or if an individual in our detention says, I'm sick or I need to see a doctor, they're taken to the hospital or the nearest medical facility to seek additional care. I mean, up to 80 per day right now. So far, over 20,000 this fiscal year have been referred for secondary medical care.
Gentlelady's
Thank
time
you.
has
Thank you,
expired.
Madam Chair.
Then a lady from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. 2 to 3 weeks ago, multiple news outlets reported that DHS had received complaints that a 15-year-old Honduran girl detained in Customs and Border Patrol's short-term custody in Yuma had been sexually assaulted by an officer. During what was supposed to be a routine pat-down, the officer reportedly put his hands inside her bra, pulled down her underwear, and groped her. While assaulting her, the CBP officer is said to have spoken with other CBP officers and laughed. This has all happened in front of other detained migrants and officers. I understand that the incident is still being investigated, but the reporting we've seen thus far is horrifying. And this isn't the first time we've heard allegations from migrants heard in other government facilities. In fact, in 2016, the Berks County Family Detention Facility in Pennsylvania had such allegations, and that's a facility that Representative Dean and I visited just last week. All of these incidents raise serious questions about institutional response to bad actors and what protections should be in place to protect an extremely vulnerable population, minors, people who may have language barriers, and people who are in custody. Chief Hastings, has the agent accused in the Yuma case been identified?
Ma'am, to my knowledge, I don't personally even know if it's a Border Patrol agent or if it was someone from ICE that was transporting the individual. I know that the investigation is currently under, I believe, the Office of the Inspector General's investigating that case now. I first heard of the case, by the way, when it went out in the media. That's the first time I had heard of the case.
Okay, so Customs and Border Patrol isn't doing any independent investigation, it's just been referred to the Office of Inspector General?
To my knowledge, I believe the Office of the Inspector General has that case.
So Customs and Border Patrol isn't doing anything separate?
Not to my knowledge, ma'am.
But officers, Customs and Border Patrol officers in Yuma are under the jurisdictions of CBP, correct?
CBP OPR that's our internal mechanism that investigates Border Patrol officers, but I mean, that's, I believe, right of refusal, I believe OIG gets the first crack at the case.
Okay. Has CBP taken any efforts to ensure that such incidents won't happen in the future in any sector?
Absolutely. As I said, we just learned about this, but I mean, we have posters and things that basically say open to any complaints, provide the numbers for any complaints that any detainee in our facilities have to call. We take all of these allegations seriously. We'll seek to, if the allegations are found to be true, then we'll take immediate action against those employees if they're indeed true, if those allegations are true.
Is there any training with respect to who should be performing pat-downs?
There's training and policies. Generally, it is preferred to be a member of the same sex that does those pat-downs. That's not always available, but generally that is the guidance that's put out to the field.
And that includes with respect to children?
Children as well. It's same sex generally. It's obviously not as, yes, it's usually it is same sex as often as we can. There are some remote locations in the field where we have to do quick cursory searches to make sure that the individuals don't have weapons. And if there isn't anyone available and the officer for officer safety needs to do that search, we'll perform that search and do so as professionally as possible.
Okay, but all the reporting said that this incident happened at the holding facilities in Yuma, so that would not be out in the field.
That's correct.
Or during
there are times that an opposite sex member or a same-sex member may not be available, and our policy does allow for cursory searches in those cases.
Ms. Shaw, it sounds like the ball was passed to you, so I understand your office has announced an investigation here. Are there ongoing efforts to plan a wider investigation into allegations of sexual assault in CBP facilities?
We do have work underway looking at the law enforcement components within Department of Homeland Security and how they handle allegations of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. That work is, I believe, out of field work, and we're in the process of drafting. So we will have work product out on that in the near future.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and we will turn now to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin my questions, I wanted to thank Representative Klein for acknowledging that we, in fact, have been drafting bills to try to address a lot of these issues. I really did take exception with Ranking Member Collins making the suggestion that all we're doing is having hearings, but that there's no action, that we're not, we need to file bills. And I believe he said something like, let's do our work, let's file bills. So, Madam Chair, I wanted to remind Representative Klein that Chairman Thompson also has H.R. 3731. The bill he was referencing from Representative Escobar is 2203. And of course, the DREAM Act, which we did get out of this committee and has passed the House, is H.R. 6, the DREAM Act. Additionally, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has filed numerous bills. In fact, it's 2 pages worth of bills addressing many of the issues that have been raised today, everything ranging from Representative Gallego's bill about site visits to detention centers to one of mine. I have filed several about stopping shackling and detaining of pregnant women. I mean, the list goes on. So any representation that all we're doing is having hearings and this is all for, I guess for fun. I'm not quite sure what message he was trying to get across. It's just simply not true. And I just want to make sure that the folks watching and listening know that these issues are serious. And Commander, I recall when you were here in February that you said, as you mentioned to Representative Jayapal, that you took objection and shared your concerns to the acting director then, Mr. Lloyd, was it?
Yes. Among those to whom I raised those concerns were my immediate
It just says that you raised concern to Lloyd. And then later during the hearing, because I do take some notes, you actually said that you were against family separation as a child welfare professional.
Every career member of the ORR team was opposed to the idea of family
So
separation.
you were opposed to it then, you're still opposed to it.
I am.
Right. So are you concerned about the reports that Ms. Shaw has detailed about the conditions that her team saw firsthand, as many of us have seen as we visited centers?
My focus remains on ORR's and HHS's child welfare mission. Border stations are a matter that my colleagues from Border Patrol could speak to.
But as a child care professional, are you concerned about some of the conditions that some of the children are being placed in prior to coming to ORR?
It is because Border Patrol facilities are for short-term holding that it's so important that all children move in the 72-hour time frame into ORR. ORR shelters are appropriate settings for children.
Well, I was trying to get you to, as a child care professional, give me an opinion on the holding facilities, but I'll move on. You know, former First Lady Laura Bush actually said in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post back in June of 2018 when this first started, that they were eerily reminiscent of internment camps. On the other side, we had Laura Ingraham say that there were essentially summer camps. And recently, a group of evangelical ministers who visited one of the sites in Texas said there were summer camps. Let me ask each of you just yes or no quickly. If you have a child and if you don't have children, if you have a little niece or nephew, is this a summer camp that you would go and place your children in today? Mr. Edlow, I'll start with you. Just yes or no, I don't need an explanation.
I can't give you a yes or no. I could say if the choice is between being in the desert or being in a secure facility, protected facility.
Well, that's not the question is. The question is, would you place your child, niece or nephew, in those facilities today? If it's a summer camp.
But what I'm saying is if the choice is between being out in the...
That's not the question, sir. You're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. Answer the question.
I can't give a yes or no.
All right, Ms. Shaw.
These are detention facilities, and I would not want my children in detention facilities.
Mr. Commander White?
Short-term holding facilities are not appropriate places for children.
So the answer is no?
Correct.
Correct. Director Hayes?
I too would not want my children in a detention facility, ma'am.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chief will be allowed to answer.
We just have one more.
Ma'am, I would just clarify, I think that was an FRC that the article was about, but regardless, we don't want children in our facilities longer than 72
hours. But would you put
hours.
your child there?
To me, it's not a yes or no question. I wouldn't put my child in that circumstance of crossing illegally.
You just refuse to answer.
Ma'am, it's not a yes or no answer to me.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this important hearing and for your leadership in this regard and on so many issues with respect to immigration policy here in our country. I was not planning on this, but I have to follow up on the exchange from my colleague, the distinguished lady from Texas, because Mr. Edlow, I am just dumbfounded at how you cannot answer that question with a simple no. Of course you do not want your children to be kept in this type of detention. And the fact that all of your colleagues are willing to say that and that you're unwilling to do so is confusing to me. But in any event, we'll proceed with my questions. Chief Hastings, my understanding is that you testified in front of the Senate a few months ago, I believe, and my understanding from your testimony is there was some exchange about supplies at these facilities, at the border facilities. You might recall that.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And my sense from reviewing your testimony is that it was your position that the facilities have soap and toothbrushes and some of the other items that they are required to have, and you described that to the Senate. You recall that?
That's correct.
And I assume you'd agree with me that those items, soap, toothbrushes, that those are central, that they're key to making sure that the facilities have safe and sanitary conditions to the extent that children or adults, for that matter, are being detained. Is that safe to say?
It is.
All right, thank you. Mr. Edlow, do you agree with Chief Hastings?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question is, do you agree with Chief Hastings? Chief Hastings just testified that he believes soap and toothbrushes are central to providing safe and sanitary conditions to those who are detained.
Congressman, I believe you're referring to the
I'm not referring to anything. I'm asking you a question. I don't know if Chief Hastings just testified to a very simple question about whether soap is considered central to providing safe and sanitary conditions to immigrants.
I understand that. Congressman, I believe we're getting very close to matters that are under active litigation.
Being very close.
Aside, I would not be able to comment on such matters.
I'm going to claim my time. Being very close to matters in litigation is not. I'm not asking you about a pending litigation matter. I'm asking you whether or not you agree with Chief Hastings that soap and toothbrushes are considered central to providing a safe and sanitary condition for those in the custody of CBP. It's a pretty simple yes or no, and the Chief is willing to say yes. I would hope you'd be willing to say yes as well.
Of course, toothbrushes and soap are important sanitary provisions to be issued to anyone in the custody of the government. That said, but in terms of what you're getting at with the comments made, I would just ask the entire committee to review the entire record of the arguments made before the Ninth Circuit, and as I said, I can't comment on anything further about the substance of the arguments made at the Ninth Circuit.
I've reviewed those arguments. Obviously, they are a matter of public record, so members of the public and citizens can review them for themselves. I believe that many in the country were shocked by the arguments that were made in front of the Ninth Circuit in the case that you're describing, in the Flores versus Sessions case. But suffice to say, I think you have perhaps clarified the record today in saying that those are items that are central to providing safe and sanitary conditions for those who are detained in the custody of CBP. And given that, I would hope that the Department of Justice, which is a department that you work for, would reconsider its position, the position that it has taken in that litigation. Because I don't know how you can reconcile the statement you just made with the position that the department has taken in that case, and I suspect in many other cases. I would just close. I was not here for the exchange, but I want to make sure we have a chance to cover this because one of my colleagues had mentioned. You stated earlier, Mr. Edlow, that the zero tolerance policy is still, quote, an active memo. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
It has not been rescinded, I should say.
Okay. Courts, my understanding, put a stop to that policy last year through a preliminary injunction, which cites both the Flores Settlement Agreement and Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. So why hasn't that policy been withdrawn? Why hasn't it been rescinded?
No, Congressman, I think we're conflating issues here. The zero tolerance policy that I'm referring to under the April 6th memo states that the U.S. Attorney's offices along the southern border will accept for prosecution, to the extent practicable, and in consultation with DHS, all cases that are referred for prosecution for improper entry. The decision about who to refer is a decision that is made from our law enforcement partners. So in this case, from Border Patrol, from Customs and Border Protection. So the memo that we're referring to here is still in effect, that cases that are referred are being, and if they are accepted, that they are being accepted provided they're amenable to prosecution. That is completely, wholly separate and apart from any, who's being referred. Now, certainly the federal government is complying with the injunction, Ms. L., as you referenced, as well as with the President's executive order of June 20th. My understanding, and I would defer to the Department of Homeland Security, but my understanding is that parents that are entering with children are not being referred under this memo. But the memo itself is still being followed.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for each of you for coming here to testify before us. As a mother, I have to say it just truly breaks my heart to hear the stories that my colleagues and I continue to hear. And the idea that separations appear to be going on is just unconscionable. The American Academy of Pediatrics said in a statement that separating children from their parents contradicts everything that the Academy stands for as pediatricians. They noted that immigrant children seeking safe haven in the United States should never be placed in detention facilities. Studies of detained immigrants have shown that children and parents may suffer negative physical and emotional symptoms from detention, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Conditions in the United States detention facilities, which include forcing children to sleep on cement floors, open toilets, constant light exposure, insufficient food and water, no bathing facilities, and extremely cold temperatures are traumatizing for children. No child should ever have to endure these conditions. The American Medical Association sent you a letter urging the Trump administration to promptly end the practice of separating children from their families at the southern border, citing emotional and physical distress associated with this policy. The zero tolerance policy has and continues to fracture families at our border as punishment for seeking refuge in the United States. Chief Hastings, if you'll answer my questions, please, in just a yes or no. Are you aware of the research trauma caused by parental separation?
I have not read those reports, no, ma'am.
Are you aware of the effects of trauma on child development?
Again, I have not read those reports.
Are you aware of the comments by the American Academy of Pediatrics?
Have not read the reports, ma'am.
Did you read the letter from the American Medical Association calling for an end to family separation because of the emotional and physical stress it causes to parents and children?
I have not read the letter, haven't seen it.
Did you make any changes in CBP policy at all? Apparently not, because you've not read the report, correct?
I haven't read the reports, but we've outlined how the policy was changed after the executive order was put out. I've provided that when we separate children now, from here on out, our guidance.
Okay. Does this committee have that guidance?
They do, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So, to your understanding, have any changes really been made to training of CBP agents and officers with this new guidance?
We've provided the specific guidance, which you have, as I said, and it's basically, it's what we were doing prior to the zero tolerance initiative.
Did you implement a system that would link each child to the parent or family member that you tore them away from?
We document the familial relationship with tear sheet that's provided, as well as in the A file or the file for the individual, yes.
And I'm going to ask Inspector General Shaw, my time is short. Is DHS providing trauma-informed mental health services to children and parents who have been separated or those who are detained in locked facilities?
I'm sorry, I don't have details on that at this point. It is an issue. Access to medical care is an issue that we're looking at as part of the broader review of our unannounced inspections, but we within DHS OIG don't have the subject matter expertise at this point to evaluate the quality of that care, but we are looking at access to care, and we'll be able to put some reporting out hopefully in the fall.
So when you do conclude your reporting, you'll make that available to this committee, correct?
We will, and it will be published for the public as well.
Okay, thank you. I just have to say this in closing. We have absolutely got to end the physical and mental harm faced by our children at the border. These policies are harming innocent children, and it simply has to stop. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. We have been called for votes, but I think we can go to one more individual for questions, and that would be Mr. Stanton from Arizona, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Securing the border and treating children humanely are not competing values. And this administration's family separation practice deeply concerns me. I am a father with 2 children, 9 and 12. And the stories that I've heard, situations that I've witnessed, they tug at the heart. And I'm trying to best understand how this administration and the agencies who carry out this practice believe it's acceptable. Just last week, I visited an Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter in Phoenix that was specifically for children under the age of 5, a tender age shelter. And let me be explicitly clear. This was not a shelter for teenage moms and their babies. It was a shelter specifically designed for babies and young children who had been separated. When I walked into the nursery, I saw babies as young as 10 months old, held in government custody, cradled by adults unknown to them. ORR staff informed me that each child had been separated from their families and that several had been separated from their parents. I want to use my time today to follow up on what I saw and what I heard. Director Hayes, how many ORR-funded shelters are in our country specifically for tender-age children 5 years old and under?
I don't have that exact number, sir, but I'll be happy to get back to you. I know we have almost 170 shelters and facilities across the whole nation.
I appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
The facility I visited in Phoenix started to take in children from the border just 5 weeks ago, and ORR staff informed me that there are plans to contract with a second facility for tender-age children in the near future. Director Hayes, yesterday you testified before the Appropriations Subcommittee that HHS plans to double its permanent bed capacity to 20,000 by December 31st, 2020. Who projected this increase, and what is the basis for the projection?
So, thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say that that is a number that we have used in reference to being up to 20,000. It is not quietly doubled. We have about 12,000 permanent licensed bed in our shelter. As I said earlier in my testimony today, it is the commitment of myself and Assistant Secretary Lynn Johnson at the Administration for Children and Families, along with Secretary Azar, that we have plenty of permanent state licensed facilities in partnership with the states and the communities that you represent in order to provide for the care for these children that are referred to us.
Of the up to 20,000 that you mentioned, how many are tender-age children? How many tender-age children do you estimate OR will receive between now and December 31, 2020?
I don't have an estimation on that, sir.
Director Hayes, on July 3rd, an HHS spokesperson said that the Trump administration was evaluating vacant properties that would serve as a permanent housing facility for unaccompanied children, looking at Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, Houston, or San Antonio area. Since the announcement, my staff has learned that Atlanta is no longer under consideration. Is Phoenix still under consideration for such a facility?
Yes, sir. And to be specific, Congressman, those facilities are what we would consider at the sub-prospectus level in partnership with GSA, trying to identify both smaller and medium-sized shelters that we can get licensed in the respective state.
Okay, I'll be following up. I'm short on time. I'll follow up with a lot more specifics about the decision-making on
Absolutely.
where that facility is located.
Sir, Arizona is a fabulous partner with ORR in the caring for these children.
Several children arrived sick at the OR facility I visited. Staff said they don't believe DHS is supposed to transfer sick children to their custody, but their experience is that DHS employees give children Tylenol to merely mask the symptoms and still transfer over the sick children to them. Those are their words, not mine. Chief Hastings, why are so many children sick when they leave DHS custody and are placed into ORR facilities?
So, sir, we've received an incredible amount, as I've mentioned earlier, 66,400 UACs so far this year. We've done the best we can. I gave the numbers of how we've increased our medical capabilities across the border, and we do the best we can to get individuals who are sick basically out of our care and into secondary health care facilities whenever possible. So we are doing the best we can with the resources that we have, and we're not, to my knowledge, turning over sick kids.
The youngest baby I saw was 10 months old, 10 months of age. Chief Hastings, what specific what specific training do Border Patrol agents receive for separating a baby who might still be breastfeeding?
Sir, I don't know what this specific event is about. I would want some more details, but, I mean, again, the thing that we want to do, and you've heard the rest of the board give testimony as well, is get them out of Border Patrol custody into the proper HHS facilities to deal with this incident, but I don't know any of the details.
Breastfeeding
behind.
wasn't specific to one child. It involves all children of that age, and so I'll follow up and ask more in writing and hopefully get answers from you about what training you're giving to Border Patrol agents as it relates to separating children who may be still breastfeeding with their mothers.
Okay.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I note that although we have 5 minutes remaining, only 50 people have voted so far. So we will ask the gentlelady from, who is next? From Pennsylvania. All right, then we will go to the floor for votes, and we will recess. We will reconvene promptly after votes, but since there's a 15-minute vote and 2 5-minute votes, probably we won't get back until 1:40, so you can go downstairs, get a cup of coffee or a snack, and we'll see you right after votes. Thank you. We're in recess.